Hey, folks, welcome to Guitar is Dead. Thank you, as always, for tuning in and sharing some time with us. I really appreciate it. Today, this is a special thrill from me. I'm introducing an interview with my old guitar teacher, Steve Luciano. I started with him back in 1982, way back in 1982, at Abney's in Orlando. They're no longer there, but they were near the so-called Little Saigon and the Milk District, a little farther away there. Steve and I talked for about 2.5 hours about a lot of things, starting with him learning guitar in his home state of Connecticut, learning from Sal Salvador as a real heavy hitter. We'll put some information on his career in the description of the video. But we really spent a lot of time on how Steve decided between these lucrative gigs that he was getting outside of music and the call of the music industry. He went in with both feet into the music industry, and he's had a really successful career as a performer, as a recording artist, as a teacher, of course. He's still teaching a lot of folks out there. Now, whether you've learned with him, played with him, or don't know him, this is still an informative interview talking about how you have to make those choices and really commit to a life in music and make it work. Now, I went to him first in 1982. I spent a couple of years with him. I then went back in 1987 to learn a little more about jazz and modes and things like that. I actually have a cassette from a June 17th, 1987 lesson. And this is back when cassettes weren't ironic. They were actually necessary to us. Of course, Steve turned me on to the real book, a copy of which cost me $30 at the music stand in Orlando, which is where Steve went after he went to Abney's. And he's played at Disney. He has had a lot of gigs. He's actually written a book called Jazz Sounds, which I'm still trying to work through. Part of this channel is getting me back on my regimen of practicing and playing more cleanly. But as I say, it's a long interview. We'll timestamp it, of course. Come back to it as you can. If you're a student of Steve's, present or past, you know what a great giving guy he is, how incredibly knowledgeable, how incredibly generous with his time. Even if you don't know him, maybe you will down the road, but you will, I think, appreciate his journey from those early bands and those early gigs and, making your bones, as it were, to creating a musical life. And that's why the segment is called A Guitar Life. And later in the segment, we actually introduce our speed picking segment, which is a bunch of rapid fire questions. Not really new there, but we try to put our little spin on it. Speed picking as in picking your brain, see? Good stuff there. Not only the picks and the amps and the guitars, but kind of some other questions, a little deeper questions. And we'll refine that as time goes on here. If you have any questions that arise from this interview, whatever segment of it, feel free to leave a question in the comments. I would love to have Steve back on the show. So if there's anything you think Steve should elaborate on, I'm sure he will be willing to come and talk to us again about that. So again, thank you, Steve, so much for your time with a young music student like me. This has been a total revelation. I was a shy 16-year-old introvert. Still not much different, but I've worked on that a bit. So this is a lot of news to me. We even talked about nuclear fuel rods, kind of came into the discussion here. So I hope you enjoy this. And this is the first of our Guitar Life series. And if you know of any candidates who should be featured on this series, please put them in touch with us and we'd be happy to interview them as well. Thank you all. Enjoy. So, you know what? It's funny is I just started the channel this week and I still have the book that you started for me 39 years ago.
Modern Guitar Method. Yeah, I still use that book.
Really?
Yeah, I still use that because I'm teaching at a college. My main gig is I'm an adjunct at a college called Southeastern University, which is in Lakeland.
Okay.
And
Really?
it's a small Christian college, but they got a pretty good-sized music program. So and because of that, that's why I'm there. I've been there a long time because I get a lot of students there because they have several different music majors that have to at least have proficiency on the guitar, if not like some of them are actually guitar majors that do like worship music, or they do a bachelor's in, in education or something like that, and they're guitar majors. So those are my more serious students that I'll get deeper into. But then some of them, they just have to pass a guitar proficiency. And some of those kids can already play, and they just, they want to get better. But a lot of them are beginners, or just they know a few chords. So they have to have a certain amount of proficiency. So they have to be able to read basic music. So I use that book with them. And they don't necessarily have to finish the book. They got to get maybe halfway through it, and they'll have enough proficiency. And their proficiency test, they have to sight read like simple melodies and sight read some chord changes. And they got to know some scales, They have to be able to play an unaccompanied piece, nothing really hard, but something that has chords and melody together. And that's something that the school set up. And there's like a music business major that has to be able to do that. If they're music business, they have to have piano and guitar skills.
Wow.
And then there's also, they have like a worship ministries thing, and they need to have, and that, even though that's not a music major, it's a music minor. And they also have to have basic piano and guitar skills.
Wow.
So, and those kind of students run the gamut. Like I've had a couple of like worship ministry kids that were really, really good guitar players. And they just took lessons because they wanted other stuff. You know what I mean?
Right.
And then I've had some of those same kids that are never played the guitar, and they don't really have much guitar skills.
Mm-hmm.
So you're really working, kind of with them to, just play chords cleanly. And, the things that they struggle the most with, a lot of these kids, is reading music.
Mm-hmm.
They just, it's amazing how, I used to take that for granted. Like you can give somebody a couple of pages as a beginner, show them how to do it, and they should be able to get a couple pages. And these kids a lot of them can't even get a half a page. Like they don't get it, It's not like they're not practicing,
Right.
I mean, I got some of those too, but they don't get it. So you really have to break it down. But, the thing is that, like I have a student right now, and this is like her second semester with me. And she's finally starting to get it now. It's like it's easier for her to play the guitar.
Right.
I mean, and so I just mentioned to her the other day that, how far she's come, because, man, she was struggling in the beginning,
Sure. You've always had incredible patience. I was going to mention, it's funny you mentioned that, because I remember when you...
Are you recording, by the way?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay, good. I just wanted to make sure that because we went through all that.
Yes, I know. My technology is this is going to be, it's just like everything failing at once. It's like, wow, it's not even like a live situation gig wise, but it's just, but no, we're all set here. And then, so we're going to put it on. You'll take a look at it, and we'll.
Yeah. No, it's fine.
So yeah, I remember when you tried to teach me sight reading the first time, and I went in there, and I played it. I learned it, but then I went in there, I played it, but I wasn't looking at the music because I had memorized it. You said, okay, well, maybe try it by not memorizing it.
Well, yeah, and I'll tell students too. Like sometimes it's an easy thing, and I'll say, you might memorize this, which is fine. It's some like an easy little thing to play. And it's okay if you memorize it, because maybe it's a physical thing that you need to fix. And so memorizing it makes it easier. But you still want to try to look at the music when you're playing. Because there is a point when you want to become a really good sight reader that obviously you don't want to play stuff that you can already play. You want to look at something fresh. So you don't want to memorize. You might check back with it once a day, but you're not memorizing. You're just trying to read through it and see how good you get at it. There's a bunch of stuff you could do to become a better sight reader that takes, that muscle memory thing, doing it every day. Part of it is just reading stuff for new, and part of it is slowing down and working on learning a position where all the notes in the position are, so you don't have to think about it, which takes a long time. Guitar is one of the hardest instruments to be a good sight reader on. Because of all the different positions that you have to know.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I was looking at a video, I think it might have been Music is Wind. I'm not sure. He's a YouTuber, and he was interviewing somebody who said guitar is the worst instrument to like learn or start with in terms of songwriting. It's somewhat ironic, but it's almost kind of tied into what you're saying. It's difficult.
Yeah, and there's things about the guitar that make it easier than some instruments. If you know like bar chords, then to transpose is easy. Especially if it's just a couple of a step or a half step either way. That's real easy on the guitar because it's the same shapes, just down a fret or up a fret or up two frets, and it's the same shapes. And when you learn where 1 4 5 is, when you know your intervals like that, then the guitar is easy. If you just play open chords, then it's just like a piano. You have to, figure it out in your head. But if you're playing bar chords, movable chords, then you don't even have to figure it out in your head. You just kind of remember the shapes that they were. You know what I mean? So there's and it's easy to, like, if you learn an F chord in the first position, you technically know all 12 chords, right? Now some of them are not, usable as far as rhythm because they're way up high on the neck, but on a piano, you got to learn 12 different major chords. On a guitar, technically, if you have one, you have 12. So if you have like 3 forms of a major chord that's movable, you pretty much have major chords covered. And if you could do that with each type of chord, then, it's much easier than, let's say, piano, where you have to learn every key and you learn a C major. Now you got to learn a D major. Now you got to learn an E major. You know what I mean? Now, obviously, every instrument, when you want to get complex in the chords and, rootless voicings and things like that, then, of course, that's a whole different ballgame, of work. But just, to play rhythm guitar, whether it's rock and roll or country or jazz, if you have that basic concept, then it becomes easier to play in different keys.
Mm-hmm. Do you know, and you said you've got students, some of them, they have to kind of learn the guitar and a piano. Do you find that like Eddie Van Halen was a piano player first, or Mario Angelo Batio was a pianist
That
first?
guy plays both hands. I've seen that guy live. He came to Claremont several years ago. There's a music store here, and they used to do that kind of thing. They would sponsor somebody to come in, like, for the guitars they sell.
Right.
So he came in and did it was small. There was maybe 70 people there. You know what I mean? So it was really cool. And he was awesome.
Right. Do you think that really helps in terms of that dual-handed facility? And
I don't know. I know because there's a lot of guys who can play piano and guitar, and they can't. Like, if you turn the guitar on and ask me to play left-handed, I can't even play an F chord. You know what I mean? Really. I mean, I can't. I'd have to, because it's totally different. Like, to play it this way. So that's something he was just born with. That kind of ability, that ambidextrous thing.
Yeah.
No, as far what if you're a beginner and you're just starting to get musical and you played piano and now you want to play guitar, sometimes for the quick thinking of musical, like what I say, use your first finger. I have to remember the first finger on the piano is the thumb. So it's like, now you have to realize that the thumb doesn't count. It's the index finger's the first finger. So when I write fingerings down, you have to, because a lot of these kids, they automatically go to the default. So I have to, so now I'll say index finger, middle finger, ring finger. I'll do that, instead of saying the second finger or the third finger. So because there's always that little, you're double thinking it if you're a pianist just starting out on guitar.
Right. That's interesting.
And a whole other thing too, and it's amazing. I think from as a little kid, I don't know, I thought of the guitar, the direction of the guitar in musical sense. Like the low strings, even though the guitar is in your hand, so people think this is the top, but it's the bottom, and this is moving, that's up, this is down.
High and high.
Right. And so to get students used to thinking like that, and I tell them it's not a little thing. You want to think of the instrument in a musical sense, not in direction. You know what I mean? Not in up and down like you would, normally if you're pointing somewhere. But you want to think, and when I say play the bottom strings, play the low strings, that's the low E, the sixth string. So to get them used to that kind of thinking too is, I think, important.
Why then do you stick with this book? I mean, there's so many. I mean, I obviously get all the noise of all the YouTube lessons as well. Do you kind of, Why have you stuck with this book for so
Well,
long? And
for the kids at college that have to pass a proficiency, they have to learn to read music. I feel that book is geared toward adults.
mm,
Not like like I went through Mel Bay when I was a kid. I
right,
went through the whole Mel Bay thing, or most of it anyway. And that's geared toward kids, the way it moves. It moves very slowly. You learn three notes. Where that book starts out, you learn the C scale. So you're learning notes on multiple strings right away.
mm,
Um, and and so I think it gets you. It's not for a kid. It's not for anybody like, let's say, under 15. I think in most cases. Um, but if you want to learn to read music, I think that's one of the better books. Now that being said, I haven't looked at all the books
sure.
out there, that are for beginners. That's a beginner book, and what I like about that book, and I'll use it, is for students that are serious. And even if they didn't read, like I get kids that can do more on the guitar than I could do. Like they're metal guys, and they can do all these sweeps and taps that I don't do, but they don't read music at all.
Right.
So I'll start them in that book, and then some of them they get into it, and that book takes you into position playing, like the second half of that book, part two or whatever it is. So then you start seeing how to play like in the second. I think it does maybe the second and third position in that book, because I don't get that far in that book most of the time. I do have a few students that have gone beyond that. Now they're doing sight reading in some other books, but you know. So that I feel like that book, that Berkeley book, I feel like pretty much all the Berkeley books are good. You know, all of William Levitt book, like William Levitt's reading books. If you're serious about reading on guitar, I think his books are some of the best ones out there. And there's other ones, and I've checked out a lot of other ones.
Mhm.
But I keep coming back to that because my sight reading skills have been up and down all through my life.
Wow.
I was probably sight reading the best when I was in my early 20s because I was doing it all the time,
Sure.
And then I had a time, but a lot of years where I wasn't doing it. And you kind of lose those skills up above, like up above the fifth fret and stuff like that. So I've gone back and started working on that stuff again. And I think William Levitt, he has several books. Well, I mean, I should say I know three books that he has published, when he was alive that are excellent for getting better at sight reading.
Mhm.
But they're intense. You got to stick with it. You got to do it, and then you just got to read everything. You know what I mean? So, and I was good at sight reading when I was young because when I studied guitar, I studied with Sal Salvador. It was old school. I mean, I had like 10 or 12 books every week. And two or three of those books at least were dedicated to sight reading. And one of them was a trumpet book, Arbum's trumpet book. And he would just randomly, like he knew the book, so he would say, okay, work on this in this position. And they were trumpet exercises, but it didn't matter. I mean, you just play them in standard key and you'd work on those. And there was a mallet book for mallet because there was like rhythms and stuff in there. And then there were regular just actually, it was four books. There was those two books, and then I had the William Levitt one, which is really for beginning sight reading. It's called something rhythm concepts or something like that, right? It's a blue book. So I did that, and I still use that book. I just can't remember the name of it right now.
Sure.
And then the other one was a really good book. It was called, there was two of them, Jazz for Juniors and Jazz for Seniors. It was published by Bellwind, but you can still get the books. I think Alfred has them.
Okay.
You can still get them. And those books are not written for guitar. They're written for any instrument. But it's a horn guy that wrote them. So it's more, if you can get through those books and play them well and sight read some of that stuff, especially the Jazz for Seniors one, then you can sight read. You know what I mean? Because that's what you're going to see in the real world. I'm not talking about like sight read a saxophone line or something, but what you're going to see as a guitarist in the real world, whether it's a session or you're going to play a show and you got one rehearsal and you do the show kind of thing. If you can kind of play in those books, in my opinion, you're going to be able to read what you see as a guitarist in the real world as far as sight reading. Now there's harder stuff, but you usually don't have to sight read it. So like I've done a lot of Broadway shows in my life, not on Broadway, but the same ones that come out of New York, the ones that travel.
Right.
So it's the and those and the conductors from Broadway, and then they have people that travel that are the Broadway guys, that sub a lot, and they'll get a gig, let's say Lion King, and they'll go out on the road for a couple of years with that show. So when you do those kind of shows, they send you the music in advance because that stuff's always hard. At least some things are hard, if not the whole thing. And you better know it because they will fire you on the spot. It's to them, it's like brain surgery,
Wow.
right? I mean, that's how serious they take it, right?
Sure.
So, I mean, and I know that, so I'm always prepared when I go in. But you got to work a lot. I mean, I'm spending, at least a week, at least minimum an hour a day on that book, if not more, depending on how hard it is. You know what I mean? Because I look at it and I know I have enough experience to know I know this is hard, and I know that I better know this. You know what I mean? You can't hide. They hear everything. So that stuff is some of the hardest stuff that I've done as far as reading and pressure.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, on the edge of your seat because what's coming up is basically you, and you have to follow the conductor because it might be a little different tonight because of what's going on stage.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? So that stuff is, and when I was younger, that's what happened when you change when you get older. When I was younger, I loved that challenge. I was like, it was an ego thing. You know what I mean? So I loved that challenge. Like I wanted to be the guy that did great, and a lot of times I would get that kind of feedback. And sometimes, like it happened a couple times, they would go to the next city in Florida, and the guitar player had no clue of what they should have been working on, and they fire him on the spot. And I've gotten called to come and fill in.
Wow.
So, I mean, it kind of gave me, not that I want to take somebody's job, but I must be doing something right. Right.
Sure.
But now that I'm an older guy and I just want to relax, I'm not, I kind of backed away from doing that stuff because I'm not into the intrigue and the pressure that and the time that you have to put into a lot of that stuff to do it. So if I got a call to do a show I've done in the past, I kind of know it, and I'm familiar with the music, I'd say yes. But if it's something new, it's I usually will turn it down now.
Sure.
Just kind of the way life works, I guess.
Well, you've kind of paid your dues and made your bones and many times over.
Yeah, I didn't grow up listening to Broadway stuff at all. I wasn't a Broadway guy at all. But from doing it since doing shows since the '90s. And doing, that music grows on. It's great stuff. Most of that, there's a lot of shows now that I enjoy listening to because I was exposed to that stuff, And they're great musicians. I mean, Broadway guys, those guys are killers, man. They're all great readers. They all have facility on their instrument, no matter what it is. They're really impressive. I've met some very impressive musicians over the years, playing in the pit.
And in some of those, like the old theaters up here, I mean, it's so tight. It's like
how? Oh yeah, no, it's like that still. Yeah, it's like that still. Everything, you're kind of, very rarely do you get into a theater where there's a lot of room. The one that is very spacious is the one in Tampa. It's called the Strauss Center. It used to be called the Tampa Bay Performing Arts Center.
Oh, okay.
But like everything else, somebody gets to put their name on it now and pay a lot of money.
For sure.
That's a great theater for not only seeing a show, but if you have to work in the theater as a musician, it's the best one. And I played in several theaters around Florida, and that's the best one I've played in because the pit is spacious. The break room, they give you a break room, and it's right there at the pit. You go downstairs, boom, you're in the break room. You walk to the pit, it's like 30 steps, and you're in the pit, and there's plenty of room. And, that's a great venue, Tampa Bay Performing Arts Center.
Nice. Are things, you're completely open now to get to the pandemic, or are you still kind of slow? Or
well, I never stopped teaching. So in 2020, when the pandemic, when lockdown, I still had students, and so we went online. I know you want to talk about that, but we went online. So I finished the semester, which my semester now ends like at the end of April. like I'm done, and then I don't do anything for my summers are slow, but then gigs so I still was able to do that until May, like May 1st to the end of April. So I was still getting paid. But any gigs I had, which I had a lot of stuff already on the books for 2020, everything got canceled from the middle of March until, through December, and some stuff in January too of this year. So everything got canceled. And then who knows? Because right now, sometimes I'll get a gig like that I just got called that week. Like I did a thing last Saturday and I got called to do it probably a week before, so it wasn't on the books a long time. So all those kind of gigs, who knows how much we lost in gigs, because nothing came up in the spur of the moment either. You know what I mean? I even have a church gig that, I've been doing for over 10 years and that stopped, we kind of went back, I think in November of 2020, we went back because we were all masked up and they had those machines that clean the air, those ozone things or whatever. And they would run those in the beginning of the service. And it was online mostly, but people can come, but it was like every other pew and it was space and you had to have a mask on and you had to sanitize your hands before you came in. So it was, of the things that I have done, that's one of the safer things,
Sure.
But and so gigs are starting to come back. Like I'm not busy, but I'm doing my share of stuff. Things are starting to trickle in.
Good deal.
Yeah.
So you went online? Is it your online lessons only for like the school that you're working in, or would you like accept any?
Well, I would give someone online lessons if they call me and they want an online lesson. It's certainly I like Zoom, and then I would use the audio is not great when you're playing. There's some things you can do on Zoom that make it a little better. You open up the microphone. There's a little checkbox but I found that it was better to use Zoom and then use an audio website called CleanFeed.
Oh, okay.
Right? Which was better. It didn't break down as much because a lot of times my students are playing something, all of a sudden it cuts out for 3 seconds, and then it comes, so I can't really hear it. That's the frustrating thing. So CleanFeed doesn't do that. It might distort sometimes, but it doesn't cut out. So it would be simultaneous. They would I would invite them on the same browser. I would use Chrome for this, and I would say, okay, I sent you an invite to CleanFeed. So they would go on CleanFeed. We'd shut the microphones on Zoom, and then we'd use that. But you have to use headphones because it really makes the mic loud. So if you don't have headphones on, it's going to feed back. So we would both have headphones. It was a pain, but at least I could hear them better. But you still couldn't play together.
Interesting.
Right? So you can't play. So what I would do is, and that's the other thing, like when you're on CleanFeed and you hit the record button on Zoom, it won't record it. It'll just record so then you got to go back to the audio on Zoom, and I would record with a metronome. I would record the second part, right, of a duet. And then I would email it to them, and I say, okay, now you have that, so work on it, and then next week you turn that on, and you play your part along, and I'll listen to you play it. So I would do that sometimes. Or if they were working on improv, I'd find like some kind of track on YouTube and send them a link to it and say, put this on when you play for me next week. Let me hear what you do. And then for me then I have I don't have it set up now, but I have a little amp, and I have a looper pedal. Okay. So let's say I wanted to show them how to play the Dorian mode, like how to improvise on something. So I would loop like A minor seventh, you know what I mean? Right. And then give them, here's the position. Now here's, listen to this while this chord's going on. So I used all those little things while I was teaching online. Right. But I'll tell you what, I could teach 5 students in a row live. And teach 5 students in a row in my own house, in my own chair. I would be way more tired teaching online.
Wow.
I'd be wiped after like teaching 3 or 4 hours at a time. You know what I mean? Because you got to concentrate more, if they don't get what you're saying, I'm pointing. No, your third finger needs to be on the fourth string, and so it's just more tedious.
Hmm.
Unless somebody's already advanced and you're talking concepts and stuff. That's but when you're someone who's just learning to play the guitar, or they're struggling with something that's physically hard to play, and you know it's a little more tedious to do that when you're not right there.
Right.
So like where I teach now, they still have protocols in place. So they put me in a bigger room because I used to just teach in a because it's a new building, it's a beautiful building, and they have a bunch of practice rooms. So I was just in a small practice room before all this. Now I'm in a bigger room, and we're like over 6 feet apart. They're on one wall facing me, and I'm on the opposite wall on the opposite end facing them. Two music stands. We're both wearing masks, and I airdrop everything to them if they need. So I don't print anything out. I just airdrop it to them. Or if they don't have an Apple thing, I email it to them. And so, and then if they want to print it out, they can. Or if not, the only thing I do is my pet peeve is you can't do the lesson on your phone. You can't look at the music I sent you on your phone. I don't want you coming in next week and you're like this looking on your phone. Either put it on an iPad or a laptop or print it out. And so they do, and I think that's that's more used to what you should be doing.
Sure.
So that's kind of what as far as the online thing.
At least it's. I mean,
I think I think someday someone's going to come up with some kind of patch that you can play live and there's no latency.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? I mean, it's I'm sure it's a difficult problem because somebody would have come up with it because everybody was going on Zoom and whatnot. But eventually something will happen. Supposedly there's something you can do, but you got to have the right gear and both people have to have it, and it's pretty complicated. That you can play at the same time together. There is one little thing I saw. I looked into it, and I would have had to got some different things, like some different, but then the student has to have the same thing.
That's the thing.
So it's like, forget it.
Right. Well, I mean, you see all these collaborations like Sammy Hagar or whoever the past year,
Right.
like, but everyone must. I mean, they're all.
Yeah, that's remote, and then you send it in, and then somebody puts it together or whatever. You know what I mean? Like they're not playing at the same time. They're playing remote. Like here's the track, so you can like video yourself, which I've done a couple times. You video yourself with your phone, and then you put the track on. You got the music playing, and then you're playing your part, right? So then you're sending them the track, but then you send them the video of your face playing, and then somebody who knows how to do that stuff puts it all together. But yeah,
it's interesting. I mean, it's hopefully. I mean, it can be kind of beyond the safety protocols. I mean, it like I say, it should help. Kind of boost the technology and kind of make it.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Let's go back a bit because you talked, about learning Mel Bay and sight reading in your 20s. Maybe let's go back to kind of your, back to the beginning when you were living in Connecticut. You're born in Connecticut, I think, right?
Yeah.
And so, why jazz guitar? Why guitar at all? And how's South?
Well, as far as guitar, my dad was an amateur guitar player, and he sang. So his high school years, it was the 40s, like the late. So he grew up. He was too young for World War II. He was born in 1930. So, but that was his music growing up, with the big bands and all that stuff, singers. And he loved guitar. His family, because his brother played some, you know what I mean? And then just the Italian family, like I think somebody else played like mandolin, one of his uncles, or some accordion. There was just music. So my father, kind of was self-taught, really. His brother showed him some stuff, and so he was never a schooled guitarist, and he never got beyond a certain point. But he had a good time feel for that music, and he had a good ear. So he knew hundreds of songs, and he knew the words to a lot of songs, and he would entertain, like at parties, like with family stuff. He'd get the guitar and he'd sing the songs that he knew, and he'd play the guitar, and sometimes there was somebody who played accordion and that kind of thing. So I grew up with that. So there was always guitars in the house, and they were good guitars,
right.
And then he wanted me to take lessons to learn the guitar. So this is like 1964, when the Beatles were big, and I was like 9 years old. So my sister played accordion. So we went to an accordion studio,
Huh.
right, to go. And the guy who taught her was good, but the guy who taught me, sure, he was a nice guy, but he was probably 6 months ahead of me in the book because guitar was becoming the thing. He was an accordion player. That's when guitar was, everybody wanted to play guitar in 1964. You know what I mean? So he started teaching guitar, and I wasn't ready to take lessons. You know what I mean? I didn't practice that much, and although I had some musical ability, you know what I mean, I just didn't practice. You know what I mean? So he'd yell at me, and because it was old school. So I don't know how long I took, 6 months, 8 months maybe, and I quit. And my dad was kind of disappointed, but he was cool. And then, like when I was 12, I was in junior high school at 7th grade, and a friend of mine was taking guitar lessons, and I kind of said, just on my own, I said, I kind of want to take again. And so he gave me his teacher's name, and I went home and I told my father, listen, I want to take guitar lessons, and this guy, his name was George Wishart, he's taken from this guy and he really likes him. So that was like serendipity because there's so many guitar teachers. Like I had one that wasn't really a good guitar player or that great of a teacher. And I wasn't a good student either. So, I mean, it was kind of both sides, right? But I was kind of ready. And the guy who we called, his name was Joe Tinari. He lived in East Haven. So it was a little bit of a hike in Connecticut terms. In Florida, to drive 30 minutes somewhere is nothing. That's your neighborhood. Yeah. But in Connecticut, to drive 30, 35 minutes somewhere you're going, over a couple of towns over, right? But my dad was into it, and we went, and it turned out that was the exact right guy for me because he was a great guitarist. He wasn't a jazz guy. He was just an overall. He knew about jazz, but he was just a guitarist, like pick style guitarist that played the music of his day, which he came up in the 50s, and and had great chops and knew a lot, could read music, knew a lot, but he also played classical guitar. He was a student of the guitar. He studied in New York classical, and he studied flamenco too. So he had 3 different styles going on. But he was a great teacher, and my father, loved the guy because he was, a good guitar player. He hadn't played. My father said, "Play me something," so he'd play something for us and that kind of stuff. And they became good friends. So my father and him became good friends. Although he was older than me, but younger than my dad, at the time. This is 1967, so we're going back. And so I studied with him till into 1970s, probably 3.5 years. Okay. And then he was like, you're doing I really can't show you anything more on the pick style guitar because I was getting into jazz. Like what he would show me, and I would take it further. So I started to study some classical guitar with him for about 6-8 months, maybe a year. And then that's when I went to South Salvador. But what got me into jazz was just as a kid, it was weird. I mean, I liked the music. I loved the Beatles. I liked, the rock and roll of my era, my high school days. I loved, Led Zeppelin, and I loved Motown stuff. I loved funk music. But what I really wanted to learn was the guitar music and the other music that I heard that was on either on a record player or on the radio or the 8 tapes that my dad had in his car, which he had like one I remember distinctly was Joao Gilberto, the Brazilian guy at Carnegie Hall. So it was just guitar and him singing, right, all in Portuguese. But as a 12-year-old kid, that music was beautiful to me. And the guitar, and then hearing, the bassy band, and, so that's the kind of music I like. So when I was studying with Joe Tinari, that was the music of his era too. So when he would teach me new chords, he would teach me a standard, like from the American Songbook. Here's how you can use these chords. And then he would, and then once I learned, he showed me something once which involved the extensions, minor sevenths, 13s, major 7s, because I started learning those, but I didn't put anything together. And he showed me something like a tune. It was like some kind of 2-5-1-6, when he showed it to me. And back then, you couldn't record the like, oh, let me record that, no, which I'll let kids do now. So he showed me several times. It was like freaking me out. I loved it. And I remember rushing home and running to my room and kept practicing it until I could do it. And that was it. From then, it was like, that's the way I want to play. I want to play with those kind of chords, and I want to play with that kind of sound, that kind of groove. And I started buying records, and a lot of guys I didn't know. That's how I got turned on to Pat Martino. I just bought a record with a picture of him playing the guitar, and I knew it was jazz. And when I took it home, it blew my mind. It was like, and before that, I was way into Kenny Burrell, so I had a bunch of Kenny Burrell records, and people like that. And so, but when I heard Pat Martino, it was like, changed my world. I was probably 14 at the time, 14, 15 years old. So, but that's how I got it. I was just into it. Like nobody said, hey, listen to this kind of music. Because I've had students, I got a student now that he's a good student and he plays his stuff. And so I'm showing him stuff, and I mentioned George Benson. And I said, well, we started, because he could play, the kid, so we started working on affirmation. And I gave him like links to George Benson stuff, that tune and some others, and he's in love with George Benson now. So he's, any more George Benson you got? I want to. So that's, for him, that's how that happened. For me, it was just through osmosis. Like I was always listening to that. No one really said, hey, you should, listen to this kind of music or anything. You know what I mean? Now, people have turned me on to other musicians, guitar players and piano players that I didn't know of that, was great. But as far as the style of music, it's weird. Even, as a kid in high school, I wasn't, I wasn't immersed in the rock and roll that my friends were. I was more immersed in the jazz side of it.
Interesting. Oh, I did, and you probably read Martino's biography. Yeah, that was.
Well, I did, and I know the thing you sent me about the thing tonight. I've like a few weeks ago, because it's funny. Like one of the guys that's playing tonight is Ed Cherry, who played with Dizzy Gillespie. He's playing with what's her name, Cheryl Bailey, who's a great guitar player too, out of Boston. I think she lives in New York now, but she teaches at Berkeley some too. She's great. And Ed's had a great career. I went to high school with Ed.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, we were in high school together. And it's funny because Ed was always good, and but he wasn't into jazz at all in high school. He was into rock and roll. Mm-hmm. So he was into Clapton and Hendrix, and I was into Kenny Burrell and Pat Martino and stuff. So we would kind of trade stuff, and it's funny because on Facebook, like we'll talk every once in a while on Facebook or whatever. He put about teachers that he's had some, and he mentioned me as the first guy in high school to give him a jazz guitar lesson. It's funny what people remember, you know what I mean? But Ed is a great player who's had, he's had a great career. He's a New York guy, man. He's playing, he plays at all the clubs in New York, and he's, toured and stuff. So he's really had a great career.
What was the first Pat Martino album that you saw? What was it?
It was the first one I bought was El Hombre.
It was El Hombre.
Yeah, and it's to this day if I hear that, I'm not tired of that album to this day, And then I have most of Pat's stuff. I probably don't have everything he's done, but I probably have most of what he's done. I don't have everything he did as a sideman because he did some good stuff with Willis Jackson, the saxophone player, and I think Don Patterson he did some stuff with. I probably got to start digging into some of that too. But
sure, yeah. I think 32 Records did with the Willis Jackson stuff, Bar Wars and stuff like that.
Yeah, right, exactly, yeah.
What
I followed his career. I got to meet Pat at the NAMM show in 2006.
Wow.
And I got to talk to him for about 15 or 20 minutes.
Nice.
Which was cool. That was another thing that just kind of happened about a month before. I was doing a gig. It was one of those shows, like a reading gig,
right.
Down in Southwest Florida. I can't remember where, but it was below Tampa, and it was like an orchestra. It was a pops thing, and it was a Broadway star. I can't remember the guy's name, but he was a known guy at that time, and he brought his own sound guy. So we're playing, and he did a couple standards. So, and it was like, I was pretty much the chord guy for those standards, right? So when the sound guy heard me on a break, he goes, "Hey, you ever listen to Pat Martino?" And I said, "Yeah, I mean that's like my main influence. I love Pat Martino." And he goes, "I'm his manager."
Oh,
So this guy, his name was Kurt Yano, and he's a legit guy. So we started talking, and that was it, And we talked for a little while, and then he went back to his sound booth, and we did the show, and that was it. Then that's when in 2006 is when I did my book for Alfred. It's called
right.
the chord book that I did. It's like an intermediate book.
So yeah, is it?
Sure. And so I went to the NAMM show. Me and a friend of mine, we went out there, and I was just walking around, and I see Kirkiano. So I wanted to say, and he remembered me. He goes, "Hey, you want to meet Pat?" Because he's waiting back behind a booth. He's not out. I said, "Yeah." So he went and he introduced. So I got to kind of talk to him, kind of alone, like one-on-one for a while. And I'll tell you, it was. And I'm not a fanboy. Like I don't ask people for autographs. You know what I mean? It doesn't mean anything to have someone's signature. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly.
I mean, I've met a lot of like celebrities, doing gigs and stuff, and it's exciting. It's not like I don't care, right. But when I met Pat, I was like a fanboy. It was just so amazing, like because he did, and I said, I know you've heard this from other people, and I know you're probably tired of it, but I told him how much he's meant to me. I was glad I got to tell him that, because he's pretty sick right now, so yeah. But that was cool. That was one of my, of meeting people, and getting to at least talk with them. That was one of the ones that was high on my list.
And I mean, his life kind of parallels yours. I mean, or yours parallels his. I mean, his dad was kind of a player, but
yes, right. His dad was a player. Loved Johnny Smith, and was very encouraging to his son,
That South Philly thing. He left South Philly or when he was like 16 or 15?
Yeah, I think 16. He went and was playing with Jack McDuff, I think.
Right.
Yeah, and never looked back from there. And then went out to L.A. for a while and all that stuff.
So back to now, you're playing jazz, and now. When did you get your first gig? I mean, when did you kind of turn pro? Would you say?
Well, that back in as you know, like back in the late '60s and all through the '70s and into the '80s, but not through the whole '80s. There was live music everywhere, right? So there was so many, like every hotel, the Holiday Inns, they all had little lounges, right? And there was bars that had live music and stuff like that. So as far as I can remember, the first gig I ever did was with another student of Joe Tinari, a guitar player who was a good player. He had a little band, and I guess he used to do it like 2 guitars, bass, and drums, right? And the other kid couldn't make it. So I think Joe recommended me to do it. I was 14 years old. It was the summer of 1969. I was still 14. And it was the Italian American Club in, I think, West Haven, in the basement. It was just like a little party or dinner, and we played. And I had a couple of fake books and a music stand and a stand light, and he called tunes, and and that's the first gig I ever did. And then I would do gigs every once in a while, from that time. And then when I was like almost 16, I was still 15. I teamed up with another guy who's a pro from New Haven. He's still up in Connecticut, Tony Lombardozzi. I don't know if you know that name. But Tony and I, we were the same age. He's a few months older than me, and we were the same age, and we got a guitar duo, because the early '70s there was guitar duos everywhere, and so we played a lot of gigs. Like we played like $15 each. We'd go into a bar and play. You know what I mean? And we did a lot of stuff like that. And then from that, that's when I hit 16, I started doing more gigs. Sometimes with older guys, like I would get recommended by either my teacher or somebody that knew my dad, or because my dad knew a lot of musicians. And I was lucky too, because I came up when there was live music, when you can do this, And then I had the opportunity to play with guys who were older and way more experienced and way better than me. So my best opportunity was with a band. My father knew the guy who played accordion or Cordavox, which was the Cordavox was the accordion's answer to the electric the keyboard, where you didn't have to pump the bellows, and there was two amps, one for the bass, and the bass sounded more authentic than an accordion bass. You know what I mean? So like he played that, and they had a band they worked all the time. It was him, a bass player, a drummer, and a saxophone player named Don DeFalla. Don DeFalla was a great musician. He wasn't good, he was great. He knew all kinds of stuff. He played great tenor saxophone. He was very schooled. Um, and he kind of took me under his wing a little bit, and I learned from the drummer and the band, all those guys would show me, and they talked to me about, who's overplaying, who's, you know what I mean? Like sometimes we'd be on the bill with other bands, and they would use me, not all the time, but in Connecticut during the union, and I don't know if it's still like this, but it was a union state. And so there was bars, there were clubs, and there was like convention, like places for weddings and stuff like that, halls, that you had to have a minimum amount of musicians to play in there. You couldn't go in there with a trio. Right? So they might say five minimum. Five. That was a real thing. So if you were in the union, you couldn't break those rules. Yeah, it's funny how unions have been weakened. But so they would hire me when they needed one or two extra guys. Okay. So I got to, and they worked all the time. So I got to work with them a lot. And I learned a ton of stuff about what to listen for, what to be aware of, from those guys, because they were so experienced and so good. And I studied a little bit of theory and music with Don, and we would play, and he would say, "Well, do this or try this," and talk to me about improvisation and stuff like that. So that was the first non-guitar player guy, and there's been many since then that I learned a lot from.
It really is important to kind of force yourself to work with people who are better than you, and it seems like they're really willing to share.
Yes, yeah. The most people are. You're always going to get that hard ass kind of guy that that calls you kid and doesn't want to has no time for you. But that's rare. Most people, if you're trying your best, and I see it now. But if you're trying your best, people are encouraging. There's a jam session, jazz jam, in town every Sunday. It's in Winter Garden, Florida. It's you haven't been here in a long time, but Winter Garden in the last 15 years has the downtown transformed.
Really?
Right? Yeah, because it used to be just a crummy little old railroad citrus little tiny downtown, one street. Well, they put in rails for trails, like all these railroads that are no longer. It's been like 25 years in the making, and it's still ongoing. Not around here, but around the state, because they want to hook them all up. They're bike trails. They turn them into bike trails.
Right.
So this bike trail goes right through downtown Winter Garden, because that's where the citrus rail would go.
Yeah, right. Okay.
And when they did that, I guess the town council, they said, well, let's use this. You know what I mean? So they kind of revitalized it. They did a lot. They built some stuff, and then they revamped the look of some of the stores and stuff. And man, people flock there. They ride their bikes and going into the shops, and they have stuff for little kids. They have like these little fountains, and people bring their kids down there, and they play in the fountains. And this bar opened up about 8 years ago. It's called Pilars, and it's a martini bar, and it's really nice, upscale little martini bar. Okay. And they started. A friend of mine went there, and they were having music like open mic night. And they would have music, and a friend of mine who moved away now. He's actually getting his DMA up in Ohio. But he went to her and said, "Hey," because he used to play there, and he said, "Would you be interested in doing a jazz jam, like a jazz Sunday? Like I'll come in with my trio, and we'll play the first set, and then we'll open it up for people to sit in." And so she did it, and it became very popular. So a bunch of high school kids and college kids, and then some pros would come in, just have a drink, sit in and play. And I would do every once in a while when they, like, if Chris or Per Danielson, Chris Rotmeyer and Per Danielson are two piano players. And Per and his wife Tammy kind of run that now, the booking of that club. Um, they didn't want to just get any piano player to do it because you had to be able to, obviously play jazz, which is a lot, but you also had to be able to talk to the audience and make sure people got a chance to play and kind of run things, right? So they called me to do it when there was a couple piano players, and it was like last minute he was sick. He said, "Hey, you want to do it?" So I said, "Yeah, I'll do it." So I went out and did it, and it went really well. And the owner liked me. She said, "You do good on the mic, and you're making sure." So I do it a lot now. I probably do it at least once a month, on an average.
Oh,
Now it's shut down during the pandemic,
yeah.
but what they're doing now is she owns the building, so she has a space upstairs that's big.
Okay.
And so she turned it, and they call it Pilars Lofts, because we're not downstairs, because you'd be right on top. It was cool to play there because there was so many people, and it was, they were into the music, and they were right on you, and it was very exciting to do that. It's different upstairs because it's really open, which it needs to be.
Sure.
Everybody wears a mask unless you're having a drink or having something to eat. And so I'm actually hosting it tomorrow.
Oh, man.
Yeah, I do it like once a month. And it would be a guitar trio. But we have the piano there if somebody wants to sit in, But these kids come in, these college kids come in, and they play. Some of these kids play great.
Mm-hmm.
They can play. It's not like, they're working. So they already play good. You know what I mean? And so it's fun, But what's cool about these kids is none of them are, like putting on airs or being like dismissive of anybody else, because they'll be up there and some of these kids come up and they're still learning, you know what I mean? But you want to give everyone a chance to play. And these kids are all cool with them, you know what I mean? They're not like, yeah, you shouldn't be playing with me. They're not like that, which is great to see, But on every instrument, there's these young guitar players come in, they play great. Bass players, drummers, piano players, but especially like saxophone and trumpet players. Man, some of these kids, they're playing great, I feel for them because I don't know where they're going to play, you know what I mean? With having that kind of skill, But hopefully things will change around. I think once we're out of this and I see the light at the end of the tunnel,
Yeah.
I think it's not only is travel going to explode, people getting back on airplanes and getting in hotels and going to the beach, that's going to explode.
Yeah.
But I think, maybe the live music scene will get better too, because people are going to want, I think they'll maybe appreciate it more. I'm hoping anyway. I'm hopeful about it.
For sure.
It seems like what's killed the live music thing is the bottom line for club owners and for,
Sure.
restaurant, it's funny because people made less money in the 60s and from the 20s up to the 80s. People have been making more money, right?
But they get more distracted.
They don't have a budget for a band.
Interesting.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's and then but people go out. It's a different world. You could stay home. You could watch 500 channels. You can watch movies that should be in the theater. You can watch it on your big screen TV with stereo sound.
Sure.
In your nice comfortable chair. You don't have to leave. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of entertainment you could just do at home. You could play games. You don't have to go to an arcade anymore. You don't have to go out. People don't go out as much as they did. It's just maybe that'll change. With this, everybody being cooped up at home for so long. We'll see. I'm hopeful. I do what I do. I'm a 60 plus guy now, and so I don't get the kind of gigs I got when I was 30. 25, 30, because like the show bands and that kind of stuff, because the guys doing that are 25 and 30 and they're calling their friends, which is the right thing to do, which is what should be. You know what I mean? The guys my age, they're, I'll get some good convention work from time to time now when it was happening. You know what I mean? But most of what I get now, it's funny, I'm doing more jazz gigs than I did when I was 30 years old, but I was working all the time back then. I just wasn't doing jazz gigs,
Right.
You got to be, if you want to be a musician, you got to really, unless you really want to break into the big time of the jazz world or whatever scene you're in, You got to be versatile. You know, I tell that to metal guitar players because metal is kind of the same thing.
Oh,
It's
totally.
specialized, you know. And I have a kid now that's like amazing. He's not only a great guitar, he's talented, like he's a gifted kind of player. And so he's learning the other stuff, you know. But I said to him, you know, if you play metal music, you can't be a freelance, really metal guy. You know, hey, we got a gig Saturday night. We're gonna play, you know, all this, you know, these bands. You know, we're gonna and just come and play. You know, it's like you got to have a band. You know, like maybe you write originals or you're covering stuff and you're going out and you're playing and that's great. But when that band breaks up, you know, if you can play some jazz and some blues and some basic rock and roll, like classic rock, and do all the other things,
Mhm.
then you're going to work, you know. And then when it comes time when you got to play that stuff, you can do that too, you know. But like I told this kid, I said, you know, he's way into Guthrie Govan. You know who that is?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he's ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
That's a guy who's known because of YouTube, right? I mean, he would have been known maybe on his own because he's so great,
Right.
but he's world known all over the world, you know. Um, this kid is way into him. He's transcribed this stuff, and you know, he play. You know, he's got those kind of chops. And we're talking the other day, and we're talking about it was a simple tune that I wanted him to play, and it had some slash chords in it, right? And he was kind of stumbling a little bit,
Mhm.
right, with it. Not because he couldn't do it, because he didn't know it. You know, he didn't know how to play those chords. And I'm like, you know, we need to go back way below what you do and fill all that in,
Mhm.
because likely you're not going to get a call and say, hey, we need somebody to play like Guthrie Govan. You know, could you come in and do this? Yeah, you're going to be able to say yes and you're going to be able to kill. But if you get a call that says, hey, I'm a folk singer who writes my own tunes and I want to record, or I have a gig and I want you to come and play with me, you got to be able to say yes to that too. You know, you can't fumble. You can't be as good as you are and fumble on this stuff. You got to know it all, you know. So that's kind of, you know, reminded me too. You know, you can't, if you have a student that can play and they want to be a musician, you got to make sure, you got to also go backwards with them and make sure they have that foundation. Because I was able to get that foundation through doing gigs. You know what I mean? Like, you know, I kind of, you know, sometimes I'd be hanging on, you know, like on a style, but I'd get through it and then I got to start working on this, you know. So you kind of learn. And we all have to do that a little bit. You're not going to be prepared for every single thing that comes along. That's how you learn, you know. But you want to be prepared as much as you can, you know. So that's something I realize, you know, with a lot of students. Sometimes those students that come in that play great, some of those are the hardest ones to teach, because sometimes I tell them, you know, for now you have to forget what you know, because they don't see how to turn it into something else. They don't see how to play on changes, you know what I mean, or how to play this kind of groove, or do, you know what I mean. I said, so you just for 6 months forget what you know. When you practice, don't practice what you already know. You know what I mean? Work on this. If you can do that, when it comes together, you're going to be unstoppable. When you can see how everything connects, you're going to be unstoppable. But a lot of kids don't see that. You know, I've had several students that are super talented, and those people aren't necessarily the best students. You know, a lot of times it's hard for them to say, okay, we're going to do that. We're going to work on this style. You know what I mean? Because a lot of kids, like most of these kids, they play metal. I tell them right away, I can't help you get better as a metal player. I can help you with a mindset that can get you better, but I don't do that. You know, that's not what I do. So, and they, no, I want to learn this, or I want to learn jazz, or I want, you know, and it's like, okay, well then here's what you need to do. And a lot of those kids, not all of them, but some of them, it's hard to teach them because they kind of resist you. You know what I mean? And so, and you could feel that, and then it just kind of peters out, you know.
Sure.
And like I had this kid now, he's at the Southeastern. Him, because he's a student and I'm his teacher and I can grade him, right? So you talk about patience. So I had patience with him, but I gave him a hard time because he wasn't practicing how to read. I said, man, you play so great, and this is something that if I just taught it to you, you can play it in 10 minutes. You could probably harmonize it. You can triple time it, right? But you can't play it right now because you can't read music, right? And so it's like, you got to do this. I don't care how good you play. Right now, you have a B, right? So you could do that, right? And he responded to it. He responded to it, and he is now picking up the slack and doing that stuff, right? Because this kid, he's one of those kids, if anybody can make it, he's one of them. You know? But sometimes you can't do that with a student. You realize right away, this guy's oversensitive or this girl's oversensitive, you know. I can't, and when I say hard time, I'm not yelling and screaming at him at all. But I'm talking to him just like I said, you know what I mean? And sometimes, you know that's not going to work with them. So you got to try something else and whatnot. But, you know, most of the time I feel like I can help my students get better. But there are some that just, they don't click with me. I don't click with them.
Sure.
And I can't wait for them to quit.
I was going to say, if you ever try.
I know that's a terrible thing to say. It is. But it's true. It's rare. But I'm thinking in my head of a couple right now, you know, a couple of students that they didn't trust me. You know what I mean? And I tell students, listen, my job as a teacher, or anybody's job as a teacher, is to show you respect and not hold back whatever area you're, you know, like I'll teach you what I know. I'm not going to hold back. You know what I mean? I'm going to try to, and if I need to go at it a different way, like if I look at something one way and I realize you're not getting it, if there's another way we can approach it, we'll do that way. You know, that's my responsibility to the student. Their responsibility to me is to trust me, like what I'm telling them. Don't like second guess me.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so some people can't. They don't trust you. You know what I mean? And what are you going to do? And that has nothing to do with how good you play. Like I could rip off some. Hey, don't you trust me now? That doesn't mean anything. You know what I mean? You know, you just have to trust me as a person that I'm. You know, that I'm telling you what's right, you know, that what you need to do, you know. And so most people do, you know, but some don't. And that's just, and they're not going to learn from you. Maybe they'll learn from somebody else, but they're not going to be able to learn from me, you know.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's chemistry. It's like chemistry.
Yeah.
It reminds me of me and my dad him trying to teach me and resisting. It was like, oh God, just do it already, whatever.
Yeah, but that's a different thing with family, you know. It's because that's a whole different dynamic.
Yeah,
it's a whole different dynamic. And like my son, if I, you know, like, you know, I mean, I have 5 kids, so you know, some of my kids are open, and then you ask them, hey, what's going on? What's happening with this? You know, they're all grown, you know, and they'll open up, and then some is like you got to pry it out of them. You know what I mean? So, but maybe if somebody else asked them, hey, what about this? They would probably, you know, they're more forthcoming, you know. So just sometimes that's just a family dynamic. You know?
For sure. So going back again, when did you decide to leave for Florida? When did you go to Florida?
Okay, so 1979 is when in May of 79 is when I came to Florida. So up until that, there was a while in Connecticut when I was in a top 40 band. Early to mid, like 73, 74, just traveling around New England, right? You know, playing. It was fun and great guys, and we had a ball, you know. But I didn't want to do that anymore, you know. So I actually took a couple of regular day jobs, but like part time, or you know, like I did land surveying in Connecticut, and I actually liked it, and I learned a lot, and I was starting to get good at the math and everything.
Interesting.
And the guy actually wanted. This is one of those turning points. The guy wanted to send me to school.
Oh, wow.
He goes, I can give you a raise and stuff, and if you want to take this course, it was a course. They were in like land surveying. You know, it's a thing. Like you can go to Yale Forestry School and learn all that. You know, because they have I mean, it wasn't that. It was like a community college course.
Sure. And
I thought about it because he was giving me more responsibility and stuff because I took an interest in it. And I quit because I was afraid I'd say yes. And then that would be it. You know what I mean? Even though I wasn't playing much. But, and then another time I took a job at making fuel rods for nuclear reactors.
Get out of here.
Gulf United Nuclear. It was, one side of it was like the Navy. It was like secret stuff for the Navy, like nuclear subs. My
Oh,
uncle was a manager at that, and he got me the job. It was on the other side. It was on the commercial side. But
wow.
we made fuel rods for commercial nuclear reactors in the early 70s. That's whole nother stories I could tell you about that. Because the security was lax, you know. So I did it and I learned a bunch of the jobs, a bunch of the different things about these fuel rods. So I learned every single job. And they offered me then they said to me, hey, would you do me a favor just for a few weeks? Would you work nights? And it was like, I don't really want to work nights. He goes, well, just be a few weeks. So it was like 11 to 7 because I don't sleep during the day. Even back then, I was young. So I did it, and then they didn't bring me back on days. Well, we really still need you, so they were giving me the runaround. So one night, you could punch out and go to lunch or something like that. So it was like lunch was like 4 in the morning. I punched out and I went home. I didn't tell anybody. I was so mad. I was like, that's it. I quit. They called me back. They apologized to me and put me back on days.
Nice.
I know it's crazy. So I worked some more, and then they offered me they were going to move to Georgia, to Atlanta, and they said you could come with us, and we'll you'll get a raise and you'll be one of the guys because you already know this job. And I was like, no, and then I quit. You know what I mean? But what I did around that time was I took a job through the newspaper. Back then you'd look in the newspaper for musicians wanted and all that. And there was a band, like a wedding band. Again, it was back with the accordion, the quarterbox, no bass player. It was a quarterbox, drummer, and a sax player who was an old guy, who was probably younger than I am now, but to me he was an old guy. And they worked a lot. And it wasn't a great band by any stretch, but they were nice guys, and it was work.
Yeah.
And I didn't have to travel anywhere. So we would do 2 and 3 gigs. We would do weddings. We would do dances, singles dances, that kind of stuff. And they played, like hokey, top 40, but it was hokey, versions of top 40 tunes. And they played the American songbook. They were nice guys, and they worked all the time, So I did that up until I was doing like a day job. So then I was cleaning restaurants. I'm telling you the story. It's a long ass story.
Oh my God.
So I was cleaning. I was cleaning restaurants from 6 in the morning to 12. Like I would do 2 restaurants every morning, 5 days a week. Right. I think maybe Saturday too, but I can't remember now. It might have been 5 days. Maybe I had Sunday, Monday off. Somebody else would do it. I can't remember. But it was part time. It was just 6 a.m. to 12 noon. And I can get 2 restaurants done in that time, right? And that's 6 hours or whatever, right? Yeah, 6 hours. So one of them was the Chart House. I don't know if you remember in Connecticut. The building's still there, but it's not the Chart House. It was right on New Haven Sound, on the water there.
Okay.
And I'd go in with another guy, and we clean the grill, we clean the bathrooms, we vacuum it, and then once every couple of weeks we do all the windows, we wash the windows. And then we go to another restaurant like Steak and Ale so one of the restaurants I would go to in the early morning, this is in 1978, was this, remember the Fern bars of the 70s, so it was called Fitzwilly's. It was in downtown. I think it's still there in downtown New Haven. So I'm there, and you want to learn something, go try to clean a woman's bathroom after a night of debauchery. It's worse than the guys' bathrooms. So I'm there, and I'm not bugged. I'm not like unhappy at all because I'm playing music, I'm practicing, and I'm doing this gig that paid pretty good. So I'm not working like crazy. I'm home like 12 in the afternoon, or I'm leaving at 12 in the afternoon. So I got the rest of the day. I don't mind getting up early after you start getting used to it. I had a whole routine, but. So this Fitzwilly's, they had like a great sound system. They had a great turntable, like top of the line stuff back in those days. And I used to put records on. Like I'd say, let me try this. Let me listen to this. Like mostly was no jazz stuff, but top 40 and funk and, that kind of stuff, right? And I'd listen to it while I was vacuuming or cleaning. And so one day I put on, and it's Steely Dan's Asia, which I haven't heard. Right?
Wow.
And I know Steely Dan. I have their records, but I hadn't got that one. I put it on, and I stop what I'm doing. I just, man, this is unbelievable. And it kind of said, I need to start playing better music. I need to start getting challenged again, right?
Yeah.
So then, I don't know if it was the same week or maybe a week later. I can't remember exactly when it was, but it's a vivid memory of me putting on George Benson Weekend in L.A.
Right.
live album. And I put that on, and the same thing. It's like I'm sitting down. I just stopped what I was doing and listened to a couple of tunes, and his great playing and singing and the band. It's just the kind of music that I just wanted to play. You know what I mean? And so it was like, I need to do something. I need to do something. I got to change my life. I want to start being a full-time musician again. So people would talk about Florida and Disney World, and you could work during the day, and there's gigs at night, and like this older guy that we knew had friends that were like musicians at Disney World and stuff, and he would tell us about it. So it was like, that's it. I'm gonna move down there, So that's why. That's really why. It's just to do something where I didn't, where I could make a good living, but I didn't have to travel. I could be a musician again. So when I moved to Florida in '79. It was I had to keep doing the same thing. I was doing day gigs, crummy kind of day gigs, and then I got a gig with a guy who I became friendly with. He had it was big down there at the time, in Florida at the time, was like mobile detailing and fixing like little dents. He had everything in his van, and we would do that. I would go with him and be his helper, and then we would do one of these big Ford dealerships. We worked a lot for them too. And so then I started he kind of taught me like the little things about body work, just little stuff. And then you detail a car, you clean it. You basically clean a car, buff it out, wax it. And so I got my own gear, my own equipment. And I was making good money with him I worked with him almost a year. I got an old beat up van. I bought like an old Chevy van for like $550. It was a mess. I didn't know what year it was, but this is in 1980. So it was somewhere in the '70s, and had stuff. And I'd go out like to people's houses and do their car in their driveway, kind of thing. I had a compressor, I just plug it in, So and it was like, man, I'm doing the same thing. I'm doing something that I don't want to do to make money, and the money was pretty good for the time. So, and I tried to do a couple gigs, and none of them worked out. But eventually, through a couple of different circumstances, I got the name of a guy. It was kind of, again, like serendipity. I was lucky. Somebody gave me a guy named Don Scaletta, and I called him up, and I said, and he was a piano player that had a band that had like a small big band, and he was a jazz guy. And I said, hey, I'm Steve Luciano. I'm new in town, and I'm looking to work. He goes, will you read music? I said, yeah, And I played styles, and he said, well, I don't really need anybody. It was kind of gruff. I don't really need anybody right now, but I got your number. So that was it. So I kind of forgot it. And like a week later, he calls me up. He said, do you want to work this weekend? And I was like, yeah. So it was at some hotel that's probably not even there anymore. And I went in and I sight read his stuff. It wasn't like it was hard, but, I did it, and he liked me. And I think he liked me. I was a young guy, and I was Italian. And it ended up that I lived near him. I didn't live far from him. So he was another guy that took me under his wing and helped me. He gave me a lot of work. He recommended me, and he was a great player. Don, he just passed away a couple of years ago. Yeah. But Don was a great piano player. He was a good arranger. He wrote tunes. So I was lucky enough to get in like that. Like when I was a young kid with those guys in New Haven, it was the same situation now. Of course, I was a little older. I was 24, 25 years old. So I was able to kind of capitalize on that more. But he introduced me to the musicians that I wanted to get to know because they did the same thing I did. They had the same sensibilities. So from there, I that's when I started to get to know guys that worked at Disney, and they said, hey, you should, come out and audition, and then we could, at least you'll be a sub, So that's what I did. And then from there, I got a gig at Disney. And then, but when I left that auto detailing thing, I left with no steady gig. I went to a music store and got a gig teaching in the music store and then doing like whatever gigs came along. So I took like a 50% pay cut for a while, but I didn't. It was like I need to do this. You know what I mean? So I was able to do it, and then it just kept growing from there. So from 1980, when I did that, like the end of 1980, I think is when I made that break. And it just every year it got better until 2020.
Oh yeah, that's a good 40-year run. I mean, hey, what was that, Abney's? The first?
What?
Was it Abney's the first?
Yes, you're right. It was Abney's, exactly. So it was Junior Abney was the owner, and his son Ronnie became the manager. He made Ronnie the manager when Ronnie was like 16.
Yeah, it was like
probably not the right move, but whatever. But I taught with them for I don't know how long I taught for them, but after a while they weren't cool with me. I was trying to get in with Disney, and with Disney would call me, hey, you want to work? And I was trying to get in with gigs, so they didn't like me. Like I said, I'll call my students. I want to try to move them to another day. I have a gig, and they weren't down with that at all, right? Mm-hmm. So it was like I'm not gonna, I want to keep working. So I started looking for another teaching job, and I went to Music Shack in Casselberry, Ron Schulman. It's still there. There's a new owner, and it's in a different location. It's not in the Butler. What?
Shack or Stand? It's Shack.
Music Shack. Yeah, Music Shack. The Music Stand was another place.
Oh, the other.
So Music Shack, and Ron was tremendous.
Yeah,
he was so cool, and his mother, who it was Ron's store, but his mom worked there, did books for him and stuff, and she was awesome. So now at that time I'm getting calls from Disney. I would call the day before and say, hey, can I change my students? And I'll call them. She goes, no, I'll call them for you, no problem. What day you want to change them to? It was well, either Thursday or Friday, whenever they can come, And so they were totally cool with me pursuing gigs and teaching for them, which I did for several years. I was at that place. They couldn't have been more helpful. You know what I mean? So that was a great opportunity to make some money, get to teach some, and still pursue what I wanted to do. I think I worked at Music Shack until I started working full time at Disney, because I started working at Disney in 1983.
Okay.
But I wasn't a full time guy. But there was so much work out there that I probably averaged 3 days a week. Sometimes I'd work a full week, sometimes I'd work a couple of days, sometimes I wouldn't work. But it probably averaged out over that 2.5 years, until I got hired full time to almost 3 days a week, which was great because I was doing other stuff too. And then once I got the full time gig, then I wasn't able to teach, at Music Shack anymore.
Yeah, it was the Tomorrowland band first.
Well, it was both. I mean, when I got the gig, it was the kids band. It was called.
Oh.
And the show was the Kids of the Kingdom. That was the dancers, the singers and the dancers were the Kids of the Kingdom, and we were the kids band, right? So we had 2 locations in the Magic Kingdom. So Tomorrowland, the theater, which is no longer there, it's a parking lot now.
Oh.
Literally, it's literally a parking lot. They tore it down, put up a parking lot, and then we would play in front of the castle.
Okay. Wow.
So those were the 2 gigs we would do. And depending on what show they want, sometimes we do both in one day. We'd walk over to, we do 3 shows in one location, then we're going to finish in another. It was just a walk through the tunnel, and then during those times in the 80s, there was so much work at Disney because we would do our full-time gig, and then they might send us over to the Contemporary Resort to play a show or to play a dinner set. The whole band would go over and play a dinner set, and maybe some dancing or something after. And we had stuff for that, you know what I mean? So we would do that, and there was just, or they'd hire us individually to do, we got a wedding, we want you to play solo guitar for the ceremony or something, So there was always, besides the work on the outside, which was a lot, there was work inside the Magic, inside Disney, there was, so everybody who worked at Disney in the 80s was not only working their full-time gig, they were working somewhere, they were doing something else either for the parks or, some club or a convention or a restaurant or something. It was great. It was a great time.
Yeah.
There was great musicians. There's still great musicians in Central Florida, but in the 80s, On every instrument you can think of, there were at least 5 world-class guys, at least
Remember-
5 world-class players, because there was so much work here.
Oh yeah, for sure. You remember Nathan Page?
Yes,
Yeah.
Nathan Page was world-class.
Yeah.
He was a great player. I remember Nathan well. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
Did you ever play with him or just?
No, I played on the same bill with him once. It's funny because I during that time when I was doing the car thing, and I was trying, I was started to do some gigs, and it's like, man, I haven't been doing anything. No, it's from when I was in Connecticut, kvetching over I need to play with better musicians, till I started playing with Don Scaletta. That was several years of not playing good music, right? So I heard Nathan play, and I called him up, and he goes, and I wanted lessons from him. I wanted to get some lessons. He goes, I don't really give lessons, and I was kind of shy with him, so I didn't really push it. So about 2 years later, I was on like a little jazz festival with I forget what band I was playing with. He was like the headliner, but he listened to our set.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
And he heard my name, and he goes, "Hey, man, you sounded great." And I remember, he goes, "I didn't know you played that good." I said, "Yeah." I said, "I wish you would have given me lessons." And he laughed. You know what I mean? But then he was always busy anyway, and then I got to know him some. And Nathan, I just revisited one of his albums recently. Just listened to it again. Man, he was a great player. Nathan was a great player.
Let's see if I can find it here. I still have the one. He was living in Altamont Springs, right?
Yes, he was living in Altamont Springs.
Let's see. I remember we got the. Where did it go? There we go. Yeah, this one. Was that the album?
No, but that's a good album too. Yes, I remember that. I forgot about that album, A Page of Elm. The one I'm talking about has I think it's called Paging Nathan.
Oh yeah. Okay.
And it has it has that Joe Henderson tune, Inner Urge, on it, and it also has a beautiful version of Here's That Rainy Day on it. He plays it solo first, like a chord melody, and then the keyboards, the band comes in, and the piano player is Kenny Barron on that album.
Oh wow.
Yeah, Kenny Barron's ridiculous. He's one of my favorite piano players, one of my favorite musicians. But anyway, that Nathan was as good as anybody. He was a great player. Yeah.
So would you say that Disney was kind of as rigorous as the Broadway shows?
No, not at all. Not at all. Disney was not all the time, but 90% of playing at Disney was not about playing great music, right? But you got to play. Disney was fun. The fact that it was the hang, it was a different culture back then. It's a totally different thing now. But we had our own break room. We were in the tunnels. The world band had a break room across the way. The dancers were, somewhere else, and you're a young guy, single, you're flirting with the dancers, you're, hanging with the other guys, you're watching movies, you're talking about the band you're going to put together with some of these other guys, and maybe after the gig you you went to a rehearsal or you play, you know what I mean? So it was about the hang more than the music. The show, after you learn the show, and you never had a sight read it, you rehearsed a new show and you got the music and you rehearsed and you learned it. And then after you're playing it for a few weeks, you got it memorized. So you don't even bring the music up with you. You know what I mean? So it's just a job. But it's still a job playing your instrument, and it's not hard, and you're getting paid well, and you have benefits, right? Some people couldn't do it. And I don't blame, I understand that. Some people couldn't play at Disney. They couldn't take, just playing the same music over and over again. You know what I mean? Because that's, like I say, 90% of it was that. But every once in a while, we got to do something different, which either we were backing up somebody like that would come in and got to play their music, or we were doing a convention show. Disney would produce their own shows back then, and some of them it was fun, it was fun music to play, or we got to do some kind of special event, which was fun, but most of it was, you got to be, so sometimes you'd go in and you'd actually hate the job, right? But you just did it. Sometimes and most of the time you didn't think about it. You were indifferent to it. You know what I mean? Like it was fine. That was you didn't think about it. Like you didn't hate it. And then sometimes it was actually fun. But what you had to do is look for another outlet. So all the time I worked at Disney, almost the entire time, I didn't really freelance. I had bands, rehearsed bands that I was. I mean, I freelanced a little bit, but there were other guys that didn't work at Disney that needed that freelance work, right? So I didn't really go after that. What I did was I went uh, the other route with guy, and we have rehearsed bands. You know what I mean? So, um, one of the bands I worked in was a band that we kind of opened Pleasure Island. It was like a 6-piece show band, and we worked 5-6 nights a week in that. So I would do my day gig, and then I'd go over to Pleasure Island and work in that band. But it was fun. It was great, and we were rehearsed. We had several different shows. We did regular dance sets, but then we had shows. You know what I mean? It was like we did a Blues Brothers thing. We did like what's the Texas guys? Bam, 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 with the beards.
That was Easy Top, right?
Easy Top. We did a
Really?
Easy Top medley. We did
Nice.
like stuff like that. Like the singer and the trumpet player would put beards on, and they'd have the guitar that twirled around. He had like it rigged up. So
Oh,
they would do that stuff. Like I was just in the background playing. So I was, but the singer was a real showman, and he would wear outfits, and dress up. He'd do Elvis, we do all that stuff.
oh, man.
So I mean, it was fun. That was, so I did that. That was one of the bands, and then like the two main things, I did some other project stuff too, but not that long. And then the other thing I did was Groove Logic.
Right.
And that started in 1995. So in 1995, we started rehearsing, doing original music, and we got a gig at the old Dexter's, which was an upscale kind of eatery, but this was the original one in Winter Park.
Okay.
And they would have live music every Thursday, and we would do every other Thursday.
Okay.
So it didn't pay. It paid like $50 a guy and a meal,
Hmm.
but we did it because we didn't need the money. We were all working at Disney, and we got to work out our stuff. You know what I mean? Like, let's play this tune. We might screw it up a little bit, but we kept playing it, and we got a following there. And so from there, we got, and this was just when the internet, like it was new. You know what I mean? But we started using email like in the later '90s, and then we got a semi-steady gig at the Pleasure. I was back at Pleasure Island at the Jazz Company, so we would go in there and do a week at a time. Like we do like once a month almost in there, we would do at least 4 nights, if not the whole 6 nights, And so we had a good fun. We did a lot of festivals. We sold a lot of CDs, and that band had a 10-year run.
Wow.
We were together from '95 basically to 2005.
Wow. Okay.
So
I have 2 of the CDs. I can't find them, but yeah, they were great.
yeah,
Awesome.
yeah, and so that those and I worked at Disney full time until 2001. So most of my tenure at Disney, like in the '80s, before that show band, I was in another band for about a year with great players that worked. They did oldies. They did, like it was they did this. They were great musicians that could do anything. But there was a club in Kissimmee in Old Town, right on 192.
Mm-hmm.
Not there anymore. The building's there, but the club's not there. It was called Little Darlings.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the original guys, the Diamonds, that was one of the owners, or there was several guys who owned it. But it was one of the best steady gigs I ever had, because it was playing all that old music, 50s, 60s, and not really 70s, just 50s and 60s, right? I don't remember doing any 70s stuff, but it was almost like a dream gig, because the place was great. It was a big, huge stage. The band was a central part of what they did, so they treated you great, right? The waiters and waitresses would get involved. Like there was a couple of times we would play a certain tune. They'd all jump on the tables and dance, and everybody would kind of be dancing.
Nice.
And the people, really appreciate it. It paid good. They would bring in these stars from that era. You know what I mean? Like who were still around in the early '80s. You know what I mean? So we would play their shows from time to time, and that was just fun. It was just fun to go and do that gig. It was challenging in the sense that to play that music and make it right, and to play a good solo without distortion. You know what I mean? Because sometimes distortion covers up a lot of stuff. You know what I mean? So to not just, play a distorted solo, to play it clean, like old time rock and roll kind of solo, where my chops weren't up for that. It took me a while to, get comfortable with that. You know what I mean? So that was a whole different thing. And so it was just a fun gig. So that was another one of the steady gigs that I had while I was at Disney that made, being a musician was a fun time. So I'm not a jazz snob. That's the music I love to play.
Right.
I do. But I have fun playing all kinds of music. But the music that is most challenging to me is jazz, and that's the music I listen to most of the time for enjoyment or to learn something. That and funk. I love old Motown stuff and the way the guitar players play it on all that old stuff. I love that stuff too.
It was, talking about, a lot of the early rock players today, his sister Rosetta Tharpe's birthday, I don't know exactly if she kind of pulled that stuff in, but like Bill Haley or guys like that, there was a kind of like a jazz.
Oh yeah, like the way they play. Like if you listen to Rock Around the Clock, it's like, I think, if I might have this wrong, I've got to go back and listen to it. But the bass player's playing straight eights and the drummer's swinging. Now that's weird, but I guess it worked because it was so new. You know what I mean? So it like every other kind of music, when it starts out, it's very simple. So rock and roll started out very simple. It doesn't mean it wasn't good, but it was simple. Right? It was either a blues form, right, a 12-bar blues, or a 1-4-5 other kind of form. Simple stuff. And, the guitar players on most of the recordings were studio guys. Like all the Wrecking Crew guys, they were all great players. But most of those guys weren't straight up rockers, you know what I mean? So, by the 60s, some of the guys, there were studio guys who were rock and rollers, but they were still studio guys, and then by the 70s, everybody caught up. The bands could play their own music. That's why those guys got, they didn't have the kind of work once the 70s hit, because a lot of the bands came in and all the musicians could play because they grew up listening to, the 50s and the 60s, and they built on that, So, think about, the guitar itself, not in jazz, in popular, in rock and roll. Chuck Berry was great. There was a lot of guys who could play. Don't get me wrong. They were great guitar players. But as far as soloing in rock and roll, think about what you heard then and what you heard by the end of the 60s.
Yeah.
Right? And then what you heard by the end of the 70s, you got Eddie Van Halen by the end of the 70s, which is totally different. Yeah. A whole different way of playing the guitar. So 20 years, is really all it took for that, and now there's so many guys that just play in a totally unique way that are ridiculous, ridiculous players.
Tosin Abasi, all those guys, the really super.
Yeah, Tosin Abasi, the guys who do the tapping, they do the hybrid picking stuff. It's crazy, and that's why there's a jazz guy, because there's a lot of great young jazz guitar players now that play an unorthodox way. They use sweeping, and they use, and they play very modern, so they're not really blues based, It's just kind of the way they learned, because they didn't listen to the kind of stuff that we listened to growing up. But there is a guy who's young. His name is, you got to check him out. His name is Pasquale Grasso. He's I don't know how old he is. He looks to me like he's still in his 20s, right? And he does a lot of solo stuff. He is incredible. His chops, arpeggios, his chords, the way he arranges a chord melody, it's like very, very, extremely high level of playing. Flawless chops, fast, and he plays traditionally. He plays like I play, only, up here. His chops, everything, his sensibility of it. That's a guy to check out because he doesn't play in a modern way, but he plays incredibly great guitar. You know what I mean? Now, I'm not saying, who knows, in 10 years he might change his style completely. But right now he's a bebop guitar player.
Interesting. where do you think, I mean, the question, it's all, it's like, I mean, coupled with, how the music industry has changed. I mean, you documented that perfectly. Where, I mean, if the pandemic and people are, bands, more venues open up. I mean, you've got so many, I guess, does it really matter if there's like a big guitar hero in pop music or anything, or just?
I don't know. There isn't one in pop music. There are guitar heroes out there. They're in bands that are on the internet that college kids know, and other people that are into music know. And they make money, at least pre-pandemic, and they will post-pandemic, from touring. And people, they have an internet presence. That's teaching music business now in colleges. You got to understand the internet and how to market on the internet. And so these guys do, and they're known. Like a band like Snarky Puppy, they got popular because of the internet. Now they play all over the world. A band like Dirty Loops, right? You hip to them? Ridiculously great. They're known because of the internet, right? Otherwise, they'd still be stuck in Sweden somewhere, and people would know them and they'd still be great, but I wouldn't have heard of them. You know what I mean? So they can go anywhere and they could set up a tour. They're not going to sell a ton of records. They're not. That's the thing. The state of pop music, right? I'm an old guy, so you could take it for a grain of salt, but now the people who play with and tour with some of these artists.
Oh yeah,
they might be great guitar players. I'm sure they are great guitar players. I'm positive they're great guitar players. But you would never know it from hearing the music, because the producers don't want to hear that anymore. They don't want to hear. They don't. It's virtuosity. Is not celebrated. There was always, think about it. The history of pop music. In every era, there was an instrumental pop hit. Mm-hmm. Right? Like even in the 80s, there were instrumental pop hits. I don't remember. Maybe in the 90s, I wasn't listening to much pop radio in the 90s, but
true.
I don't know if there's any instrumental pop hits. I know there isn't any today, that are just instrumentals. That think of the 70s. Chuck Mangione he was like top 10, right? In the early 80s, Herbie Hancock had, and then also the Ghostbusters thing, that was a hit. It was a instrumental. There's always, and of course before the 70s, there was tons of instrumental hits.
Oh yeah, true, interesting, yeah.
So you don't have that anymore. There's no the instrumentalist in the pop world is not really celebrated. It still is, people still appreciate it.
Yeah.
But the pop world, man, I'm all for all kinds. I know there's great art in hip hop music. There's guys who are poets who put it together with music, and they're great at what they do. So I don't say, oh, that music sucks. I don't make a value judgment on somebody else's music. It's not for me, but that doesn't mean it's still not great. Opera's not for me either, but doesn't mean that that's not difficult, great music. You know what I mean? So that's what makes the world go around. Right. But when you listen to the music you love and it doesn't give you an emotional connection, then it's not worthy. It's not art. You know what I mean? So, what I mean by that is, it can make you happy. It can also make you cry. Not because you're sad. It's just so beautiful. Right. You know what I mean? And if you don't get that from the music you listen to, then you're not listening to the right music.
That's interesting.
Or you got no feeling.
There you go. Well, I mean, it's like what imprints on you as a kid too. I mean, it's
now there's the nostalgia too, and that's a different thing.
Yeah.
So I can listen to something like Chicago, right, which is still one of my favorite bands. Terry Cass, one of my all-time favorite guitar players. He's uncelebrated, but he was a genius. He was a great player. But anyway, when I listen to that music that I grew up in high school, I love the music, but it also brings back those nostalgic memories. You know what I mean? So that's a different thing. But music can do that too. So no matter what era, that's why I say you gotta connect to the music of your era. So if some kid that's 18 years old, he listens to hip hop, that's fine, because that's gonna be with him his whole life. Whatever he's listening to now. You know what I mean? Because you got to connect with that music. But it doesn't mean it has to be the main music you listen to, because it wasn't for me. It wasn't the main thing I listened to, but I still love that music and I connect to it. But what I was really listening to back in 1971 and 1970 and 72 was jazz, was jazz guitar, jazz horn players, piano players. I was immersed in that kind of music.
It's interesting. I mean, you grew up in the 60s, you're talking about high schools, how you didn't get sucked into like the whole rock and Hendrix thing where it was like, whoa, I mean, that was like the
No, and I appreciated it, like I say, but when I felt like practice time was so valuable that when I was practicing, I wanted to only work on stuff that I wanted to do to get better. Like I wanted to play like, Wes Montgomery, like Kenny Burrell, like Pat Martino. Those were my idols. You know what I mean? Those guys. So I felt like if I was working on a rock and roll lick, I was wasting time, my time. You know what I mean? For what? Now that being said, I could play rock and roll. I could play classic rock guitar only because when I was in that band traveling around New England in the early '70s, we had to play rock and roll too, like Johnny Winter stuff, and because that was popular, and I wasn't good at it. Just like I had to learn how to play a clean rock solo, back in the early '80s. I mean, not that I wasn't good at it. I wasn't. I had to think about it. It just didn't come natural.
Yeah.
So, like with the rock and roll thing, I wasn't good at it. Truthfully, I couldn't bend a note and sustain it in key, in tune, and I couldn't vibrato a note, and I didn't have those kind of chops.
Interesting.
So that's the thing about jazz guys is when I learned how to improvise, and this is something maybe is worthy for other people to listen to, is when I learned how to improvise, I right away started playing on changes. Tunes so I knew how to play on, like when the tonal center shifts, and then I learned how to play on a 2-5-1 and a turnaround, and I learned that stuff, right? So to play a whole solo on E9 on one chord was a different skill that I didn't have, right? I had the skill of, okay, those are my ideas here, and I'm moving here. You know what I mean? So I didn't, and that's still that, I was a kid, just young. I wasn't great at jazz. I mean, I was okay at jazz, at that time, but that's what I did. But I wasn't good at just playing on one chord, right? So not only was I not good at a sound, I didn't have a rock and roll sound, right? I didn't have the right hand is different, bending and how you hold your hand, how you vibrato a note, it's different. And I didn't have that yet. And my cousin, who is a tremendous rock and roll guitar player and a very talented writer, and he loved rock and roll. That's what he did. He was cool enough to sing in that band too and play bass most of the time. So most of the time he played bass. But when we had a real rock and roll song, we would switch, and I would play bass and he would play guitar because he would kill it. So he was the one who taught me, like, here, you got to do it this way. No, you got to hold your hand the wrong way to play the right way. You know what I mean? And you got to do this with your pick. And I would practice that every day. We were on the road or whatever. During the day I would get up and try to bend notes. And so, like one tune a night, I would try to do that on the solo that I played. And little by little, playing 5 nights a week every night. After a few months, I started to get it. And then I started to get better at it. And then my cousin was cool enough to just let me play the guitar all night, and not, even though guitar was his main instrument. So he was like, cool enough to do that. And he was more talented than I was at rock and roll. No question about it. So that was, something that I was, I'm grateful to him for, because being able to play rock and roll and be versatile was what I needed to be able to do once the '80s hit, and I had to, do a lot of different stuff, and if I couldn't do it, I know that guys my age, like kids now, they learn all that stuff, but guys my age, if they were into jazz or more commercial music, they never learned to play rock and roll, because they never made that switch, they were never able to do it. So I was lucky enough at a young enough age to be thrown into that situation. But to be able to play on one chord, if you're into jazz and you're playing, man, that's a different skill. to get a lot of stuff going. It takes more knowledge of the fingerboard and just, more stuff going on.
So just to kind of round out with like, we got a couple of your CDs here, Romantic Guitar and Christmas Guitar.
Yeah.
And are you working on?
But let me tell you about those.
Okay.
That was done back in like the early 2000s.
Okay.
I was doing stuff for Muzak, right? I was getting paid.
Ah.
Like I would write these tunes and I would record them at my house and I would send it to them and I would get checks, like every quarter from BMI. And back then it was doing well. Like there was another one I have that is better than those that I did in a studio that I did with drums and keyboards and stuff. And that did really well with music. And I made decent money. I mean, I wasn't able to buy a house with it or anything like that. But it was nice money for about 5 or 6 years, right? And then that whole Muzak thing dried up. And I still get, they're still using some of the tunes.
Oh, yeah.
And I get, every quarter I'll get like $15, something like that, But that's where those were from. So they said, if you want to try it, you got to change the names to them. And you can put them up on CD Baby. That's what they got. If you want to do, besides giving it to. So that's what I did. Well, let me just do that. So they're not even recorded that well, those two. I have another one that I did actually professionally in a studio. And those are some of the tunes I've heard, like when you hear background music, I haven't heard them lately, but I've heard several of them, like, on like background stuff when, in a restaurant or, whatever, I'll hear it and it takes a second to realize, oh, that's me. That's my tune. Right. And so that's when I was making, I'd get a check for $400 or $500, which was, it's not bad, but that's where those came from. So they're not really any albums that I would say, hey, I'm proud of this, or that it was like it was an assignment kind of thing. You know what I mean? So I did the best I could, but it was more of an assignment than this is the way I would really play this stuff. You know what I mean? I kind of had to water stuff down and make them all like under 3 minutes. 3 minutes or under was their thing. And not crazy solos. If you took a solo, it was like more melodic, kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But it was like, say, like Disney, it was just a gig. It was another gig. So it was like sitting right where I am right now, writing a tune, thinking about it, then, writing some parts to it, and then going on GarageBand and recording it, and then sending it to them. So
that brings up to patience in playing and kind of building a solo. Any tips there that you...
Well, first off, like if we're talking jazz now.
Yeah.
Okay. So, the thing I found from teaching that you don't realize is that when you're trying to teach someone how to solo, besides knowing their scales and having some chops and understanding harmony, a student has to know when the chords change. Some people don't hear that. Which, it took me a while to realize that, you know what I mean? So I that's what I check first. So I'll use, like, one of the tunes I use for that is Blue Bossa. Because Blue Bossa is in C minor. Now there's a lot you could do when you get to the 2-5-1 and you get to the F minor, but it's all still in C minor. So you can play in C minor on those chords, right? But there's those few bars. There's 4 bars that go to the key of D flat, right? It's like E flat minor 7, A flat 7, D flat major 7, right? 2 bars of D, so it's 4 bars. You can't play in C minor anymore. You got to switch. But it's a spot where if you're aware of it, you keep listening and you're aware of it, and then you move and you change and you play in D flat, right? So that's what some people hear that automatically. I heard it automatically, So when you do that, you don't realize that other people don't. It's like people with perfect pitch when they're born. They don't realize that everybody can't do that, right? I had a student like that once. He just learned he had perfect pitch, and he didn't know, and he thought everybody could do that, It's like, no, not everybody can do that. But anyway, so that's one of the things you want to make sure of. In order, when you want to hear, if you have trouble hearing the changes, You have to, and you have to do this anyway, whether you hear the changes or not. You have to know the melody. You have to be able to play the chords and hum the song, right? So if I'm playing blue bossa, I got to be able to go. Ba da 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 da. Right? I got to be able to do that.
Right.
If you can't do that, then you're not going to hear the changes.
Yeah.
Right? So somewhere in my head when I'm playing, somewhere, it's not forefront, but somewhere the melody is going on.
Mhm.
You know, it's amazing how your mind works because you're thinking when you're soloing, there's a lot of stuff going on that it's not forefront, but it's there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so that's one of the things. You have to have a relationship with the melody.
Mhm.
Otherwise, you're going to get lost. You're going to get lost in the tune, especially a complex tune. You know, like blue bossa is not a complex tune.
No.
You know? So that's one of the things. So when I'm teaching solo, and that was your question, right? How do I approach teaching soloing?
Yeah, building them up or just as you.
Right. So that's one of the things, and I also start with the blues, like the 12-bar blues, because even though you're playing in one key in the blues, right? And I start with minor pentatonics, just like any rock and roll guy would, right? I start with minor pentatonics, but then I work in the major pentatonic. So let's say we're in the key of A, right? So the minor pentatonic has a C natural. The flat 3 is a C natural. The flat 7 is an F natural, and then the flat 5 that's not part of the pentatonic, but it's there, right? Is the E flat, right? So you teach that. You teach how you can bend to that E flat, or you can, and you play the flat third and stuff. But then, like on the 1 chord of a blues, you can play the major third. You can play the C sharp, but only on the 1 chord does that C sharp work. But if you play it, right, it works. It's like, okay, so here, I don't have a pick, but so that's A, like A blues, right? So you got this, right? But now you got this too. That lick, that's a blues lick, but that's a major pentatonic lick. That's not a minor pentatonic lick, right? So all the notes of the major pentatonic work for all the chords, all 4 chords, except for the C sharp. That only works for the 1 chord. So if you play it on the 1 chord, that's a whole new sound. And so to get kids to know when they're on the 1 chord, so you play the blues and don't just, because a lot of rock and roll kids, they never listen to the change because they're always just playing in 1 key, right? So you know when the 1 chord comes in, right? And then just play. You can play the minor third, but play the major third also. You know, so that's one of the things I'll teach when I start teaching, improv. So then the other thing I'll go to when we're still in the blues is how to work in the modes of the major scale. Okay, so when you're on the 4 chord, you can play what's called the Mixolydian mode on D7th. You can play. Which it's a D scale, it's a G scale starting on D, right? So it has the C natural, right? So now you can use not only a pentatonic, you can play out of a major scale on the blues if you use it the right way. All right, so then when you're on the 5 chord, you can use E mixolydian. So it's the same scale, you just move it up a whole step. Now you can play that on the 5 chord, right? Now, some of that stuff doesn't work when you're playing traditional, like Mississippi Delta blues, It might not work that well. But if you're playing a progressive kind of groove, it's going to work great. Just listen to somebody like Robin Ford. He's like ridiculous, and he uses all kinds of stuff when he plays the blues. So, I teach that kind of thing. And then I teach when the solo, like we'll talk about standards, like blue bossa, which is not in the American songbook, but it's still a standard per se. And we'll use major scales, because major scales are minor scales, right? So I'll teach, like we're in C minor, and an E flat major scale, play out of E flat major, right? But now watch out for this note, because that scale, or even a C minor scale, if you're on C minor and you're playing a C minor scale, there's a note that doesn't fit in well with that. So you're really only playing what's called a 6-note scale, what's called a hexatonic scale, if you want to use the educational word, right? That's 6 notes. That's all it means. Because one of the notes, the B flat, the 6, right, of a minor scale, is not a good note. Like if you play that B flat on a C minor, so if I have a C minor 7 and I have, that note against that doesn't sound good. You can use it as a passing tone, but you can't dwell on it.
Right.
So now you teach them, because if they know their major scales, which I teach them, you play, instead of C minor on a C minor natural, you play C minor Dorian on a C minor. That B flat, the raise a Dorian mode raises the 6. Now you have a B natural, right? So now against C minor, you're actually playing a B flat major scale starting on C. You don't think of it as a B flat major scale because there's other notes you want to accentuate,
Right.
You want to think of it in the right way. But if you know the fingering, you don't have to learn anything new. You know what I mean? You have that fingering. I gotta find. Oh, here's a pick. So if I have this, all right. So here's C minor. I'll adjust this a little bit, right? And if I'm gonna play this scale, that's a natural minor. So that note, unless I go to a different chord within C minor, then that note's great. But just on C minor. So now I want this, which is the B flat scale, starting on C. So you have that note, right? That's a cool sound. That's like that Pat Martino sound, right? That's the Dorian mode. So that's what I'll teach them. So I'll teach them, just play out of the C minor Dorian. It's going to work here. It's going to work here. Now then, once they could do that, then it's like the next step. Okay, what do you do on a 5 chord, on a 2 and a 5? What do you do when it's here? Then you learn the altered scales, or you learn how to go back to that C minor and use that B flat, because that's the flat 9 of G7. Now it's a good note. Now it does work. But see, they got to hear that.
Right.
And that takes a while. You know what I mean? To know when you're here. Now you're on F minor. So now you can play that note, because that note's going to work. And when you're here, you can play that note. You just can't play it here. You can't dwell on it, right? But now Dorian mode, when you get here, it's going to sound great, right? Now when you get here, you got to go to D flat major or play on the 2-5, which comes. I don't have kids play on 2-5-1s until they can hear the tonal centers. So they're just playing on major and minor scales, right? The modes of the major scale, that kind of stuff, right? The other tune I teach for improv when I start is How High the Moon. Because How High the Moon goes to 3 tonal centers, whole steps down, right? So it starts in G, right? So it's and then right away you got a 2-5 going to F. So now you're in F. You don't have to think of G minor. Just go to F. Then you go to E flat. So there's a couple of little things where you got to use your ear, but most of the time, if you just play in G, then play in F, then play in E flat, you can get through the whole tune. But you got to hear when they change. All right. Then once they get good at that, with a couple of other things I'll give them, then it's like, all right, now we're going to go back and we're going to learn how to play on each change, and we talk about 2-5-1s. We talk about the melodic minor and the harmonic minor modes, and the modes of those scales, and then playing on chord shapes too. That's a whole nother thing that people think, well, that's simplistic, but it's not. There's a lot of great players that just think chord shapes, right? So we'll talk about that. And then you got to find what works for you, because eventually, that's what everybody does. You take in all this information, and some of it you discard. It doesn't mean it's not good information. It's just not working for you. You know what I mean? Some of it you might come back to several years later, and then it does work, And then some of it works right away. You got to find what works, and then you got to build on that, because no teacher can make you a good player. They can just give you the information. They can encourage you, give you the information. Hopefully, they can answer the questions you ask. But then it's up to the individual to work it out, make it his own.
For sure. I still have, I don't know if I ever sent you the digital files from some of my old lessons.
Yes, you did. Yeah, and I have it somewhere in here, and I still have that. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, man. Awesome. Would you be up for a round of, I'm going to call it maybe speed picking, just like one quick question off the top of your head?
Oh, you mean you
Yeah,
want to ask me a question or you?
yeah, a bunch of questions. It's right off the
Yeah,
top.
go ahead. Yeah, just speed answering me.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
speed
sure.
round.
Yeah,
Okay, the gear you cannot do without.
a good amplifier.
Mm.
You
Gear
want
you've
more?
bought.
Or just everything is obviously I've always had good guitars,
Yeah.
so that's a given. But having a good amp is important.
Uh, you had concert for a while, didn't you? Fender concert.
Yeah, I wish I still had it. I
Uh,
sold that was a pre-CBS.
oh man.
Yeah,
Oh geez.
stupid. I regret everything I ever sold gear
Right.
wise, guitars and amps.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah.
That's
I
rough.
don't sell them anymore. I just hold on to them.
That's right. That's
Yeah,
right. I hope my wife can hear
yeah.
that.
I know.
All right, so that's what we'll pick up. Gear you have dropped or might not use again.
Oh, I have a lot of pedals, because I use a pedal board when I'm playing like commercial stuff, shows, or I know it's going to be a gig. We're going to play some rock and roll, so I have a pedal board that I use that's active, and I'm always trading out gear. And some of the things I bought, I just I only used it a few times. I need it for a show. Now I still have it, but like a flanger I had to buy for a certain show that I was going to do. So I bought it and I used it for that, and then I took it out of my board. So it's there. I have a bunch of gear underneath this table right here, like a bunch of pedals that I don't use anymore, but I might use them someday. And I'll take stuff in and out. Like I have a chorus pedal that's kind of an old school thing. Guys like me use chorus, and I don't have it in my pedal right now, but I have to. I'm doing a Broadway review thing at UCF coming up, and I'm looking at the music, and there's some chorus stuff in there, so I'm gonna have to put it back in.
Ah, geez, interesting. All right.
So mostly the stuff I discard is pedals.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, strings and picks that you're using.
Interesting. Okay, so picks. All right, so I for a long time I had used from being a little kid till probably just a few years ago. I had only two different types of picks I used. I started out with Fender mediums,
Mm.
and then I switched to. Let me see if I know I still have a bunch of them around, but yeah, this pick right here, and I still use them, but I don't use them as much. Can't get to it. Yeah, this Dunlop Tortex 1.14, right?
Wow.
It's thick. Yeah, I like thick picks.
Wow.
And so I use this for a bunch, but to be honest with you, like I would buy 6 dozen at a time, but they're not like a lot of times it'd be like these burrs on them, and I'd have to file them and stuff because they stamp them. Maybe the thing wasn't sharp. Who knows? But I started listening on these guitar forums, and a lot of guys use these ProPlec picks. These. I got another one somewhere. So I started using these because I tried changing picks a bunch and I never liked them. I bought so many different picks over the years. So I changed to these ProPlex, and this is 1.15. So I have this and this one, this dark one. Sometimes it doesn't. It kind of slips in my hand sometimes. So there's another one that's ProPlec. It's the same one, but it's a little different material, and it's a little easier for me to. I don't really have a problem gripping it most of the time, and it's this one, yeah, the one I use. So it's still 1.15. It's the ProPlec.
Nice.
But it's a different material, so it doesn't feel as thick as this one,
Interesting.
and it just sits a little easier under my thumb.
Mm.
So these are the two picks I'm using now.
Nice.
Yeah,
Nice.
I can't use the little ones. I know a lot of guys use those little jazz pointy picks. I just tried them. I never liked them. I've tried some expensive picks, and they just didn't seem worth the money, and I didn't really even like them that much. But these, I'm like, this is the standard pick shape. There's a name for this that I can't remember the name of this shape. But pick guys know it because these guys in these forums, they get so like it's like, oh my god, I can't. My head's gonna explode. You know what I mean? Yeah. They're so nerded out on everything. But I did learn about these picks from that forum, and I like these. I tried them, and I like them, so that's what I'm using now.
Nice. How's your action setup or anything else custom in your setup?
I like low action.
Mm.
Okay. So this is a Benedetto, this guitar, which
Mhm.
I had a little over a year now. It was a used one, but it was never played. It was like a collector had it. So this is a guitar I love playing. It sounds great, but it's not the easiest of my guitars for me to play. It's
Mm.
not hard to play,
Mm.
but it fights you a little bit, which is not a bad thing. So up here, up in the high register, I do have to, to play a chord, full chord up in the high register. I gotta, push, and I'm feeling it. You know what I mean? But I love playing it. But my action's always set low. So my 335 that's in the case that I'm going to use later today on a gig, that's thin neck, low action. My Strat is a thin neck, low action guitar.
Mm.
Especially now that my hands, I got a little bit of arthritis in them. My thumbs on both ones, give me fits sometimes. It doesn't affect my ability to play, but it does sometimes affect my playing.
Mm.
Sometimes, not all. So I'm lucky with that. But all my guitars are set up with low action. That's kind of what I always liked. Some guys, I have a good friend, a great guitar player who's I can't play his guitar. If I play it for 5 minutes, my hand, I'm like, it's killing me. I get tired. And he plays great on it. So everybody's different.
Speaking of all the guitars, how big's your guitar and amp collection now? Since you
All
don't
right,
know.
so I think I have 11 or 12 guitars,
Mhm.
but I use 5 of them on a semi-regular basis. All right, so I have this out because I'm using it on that show at UCF. This is a Ramirez,
Ooh.
cutaway class, nylon string guitar. So I use this, not that much, but I use it,
Mhm.
and I'm gonna be using it. I got those 3 on the wall, but I don't use that much. One's an L7 from the 40s, one's an L4 from 1968, and the other was just a 12 string that I'll use when I need a 12 string, which is rare now because I don't do that many shows anymore.
Right, sure.
But the ones I use my Strat. I got a Strat from 1988 that I've changed the pickup several times. I've had several fret jobs on it.
Wow.
I've got my 335 that I've had since the early 70s that I still use. So 1, 2, 3. I've got a Taylor acoustic 4.
Mm.
And then this one is 5, the nylon. Those are the 5 that I'll use on gigs. But the ones I use most are either the Benedetto, the Strat, or the 335. Those 3 I use a good amount.
Nice.
Yeah.
So, okay, well, I kind of answered. What is your current amp?
Okay, so I have the current one that I'm using as much as I can is a Hendrickson, which is a small company out of California. It's a jazz amp.
Okay.
Solid state, but it's a great jazz amp. It's got 2 separate channels, separate EQ in both channels. So when I have to do, like on this show, I'll plug into that because it's okay for rock and roll. It's not great, but it's okay. And for the show, it's going to be fine. And I'll have my pedal board. And then in the separate channel with a separate EQ, I'll have this. It has a balanced out, right? So which is great, and sound guys love it. And whatever EQ you're using, that's the EQ that goes out. So when you use the second channel, that's the EQ that goes out. If you're using the first channel, so it's awesome. So I love that amp. It's light. I also have a which I don't use hardly much anymore, but if I do like a convention big gig that's loud, I'll take it. It's a Fender Hot Rod Deluxe. That's my amp. And then the other amp I use a lot is it's not here, but I have one. It's the Rolling Cube, but the bigger one.
Oh, right.
Like maybe this big. And I use it because you can use batteries in it. So if I have an outdoor gig like a wedding ceremony I got to play, I don't have to worry about finding a plug or running an extension cord. The batteries are just take regular double A's, and they'll last like 12 hours of playing on them. And I'll use that a lot. I use that amp a lot. And that sounds pretty good. It's got effects that I'll use the reverb and maybe just a little bit of delay. I don't use the distortion or anything like that. I just play it clean, and I've used that amp. So those are the 3 amps. Actually, that and the Hendrickson I use. I don't really even use the Fender much anymore because it's so heavy.
Man. Yep.
Yeah, it sounds great. I love the amp, but
Oh
it's,
yeah, yeah,
you
yeah.
know, it's heavy. So, but those are the three amps that I have.
We already talked about the Fender Concert, but is there any other gear you regret selling? Which are kind of,
Oh yeah, well, guitars mostly. You
yeah.
know, not so much gear. I mean, because that's really the only amp I've ever sold.
Okay.
Um, I still have an amp I bought in the '80s. I don't use it much, but I still have it because it's the Fender Ultra Chorus,
Oh,
and they don't even make it anymore. But it had two speakers, two 12s, and when you hit the chorus, it broke it into stereo. So chorus sounds best on stereo, and that was the best sounding chorus I ever heard. Better than the Roland Jazz chorus,
oh, that's wild.
I think. It was a great sounding chorus, and I used it a lot, but I kind of wore the amp out. It's a mess. I put new speakers in it recently, but it's just such. It's all. I need a new screen for it. It's kind of all beat up, but I still have the amp. So the only amp I ever sold, I do regret selling that concert amp. I do regret that. Yeah.
You,
And I regret any guitar. I sold a bunch of guitars through the years, and I regret every one of them. Yeah.
yes. Is there any gear you have your eye on, gear, guitar,
For gear for my guitar.
or gear or guitar? Any guitar you?
Yeah, I mean, if I had like a lot of disposable income, which I don't right now, um, I would probably get another Taylor. You know, a bigger one, because the one I have is more of a smaller one. It's a great guitar. It's beat up. It's like road beat up, but I like it. I have a cheap Martin acoustic that I use that's beat up, that you can plug it in and it doesn't feed back because it's not real. It's not even real wood. So a lot of times I'll use that on shows because I don't have to worry about it feeding back or anything, you know. But if I'm going to record, I use the Taylor, you know. Or if I'm going to do a gig that it's really going to sound, I need it to sound really good, then I'm going to use the Taylor, you know. So I have that, but I would like a better acoustic guitar.
Mm.
You know? I mean, but like any guitar player, if if you had unlimited funds, I'd probably have 100 guitars. You know, because there's some boutique, like solid body guitars I'd love to have.
Mm.
But everything's expensive now.
Yeah, well, that's a thing. Yeah, and it's how you choose too. You just got to buy one of everything if you can. What's your favorite chord and voicing of that chord?
Ooh, I don't know. I mean, well, okay, I'll show you. For open chords, this like E minor, this E minor 7 chord, it's like a James Taylor kind of, that kind of sound, you know. So that I like that open. So it's like that chord, you know. It's probably for open chords. I like that. I don't know. I mean, I use this voicing a lot for like, and because this is an all-purpose like this. It's got you got the fourths going on. That could be a G major, like a G major 9 chord. It could be a B minor 7th. It could be an E minor chord. So I use that voicing a lot. I kind of like that voicing. You know, I don't know if it's my favorite. I had a bunch of favorites when I was a kid. You know, the first time I heard this chord, which I never use because it's got all 6 strings, that major 9 chord, I fell in love with that chord. You know, I just played that chord. I remember that. You know, the first time I played like an altadama with a flat 13, like 13 flat 9. I mean, that chord, was one. Voicing. So those kind of voicing, I use them in smaller. I don't play a lot of rooted, with the root unless there's no bass player or something. So more of my chords that I'm playing are more like little drop 2 and drop 3, 4-string chords and stuff when I play. But it just kind of depends on the situation.
Mm.
But I guess that's the answer.
Okay, nice, awesome. I think you might have mentioned a little bit. We talked a little bit about that moment when everything kind of clicked and you really felt like I'm a guitarist now.
Well, I mean that moment of clicking has happened several times for me on different levels. But I don't know. I can't point to a moment. It was probably sometime in Connecticut in the early 70s playing with those guys that like the sax player and stuff where I felt like I was fitting in and I was contributing and not just there because they needed an extra piece, So, and I remember that feeling of feeling like, man, I'm contributing, you know what I mean? But I've had several moments, you know, where I got, like, yeah, I'm finally doing this right, like doing the rock and roll thing, you know, was something, that I remember that light, what one night, everything kind of clicking for me, you know, um, I'm improvising without thinking about what I was doing. I remember that stuff starting to happen and clicking, you know. But the thing about jazz, and this is something like you take classical guitar, or even like a lot of times it's some metal stuff, because it's the same head. Classical guitar physically is way harder than any other kind of guitar. I mean, it's just demanding, right? So you practice 4 or 5, 6 hours a day to work on these pieces that are very difficult to play to make them sound like they're not difficult, right? I mean, but so when you do that, it's hard. But when you do that, most of the time, if you play it flawlessly or almost flawlessly, man, you're just like, I did it. You know what I mean? But you can practice jazz, because jazz, obviously you need chops. So you practice that. You got to have certain things that you can do. But jazz is not about being able to physically do something most of the time. Obviously you got to be able to do that. But it's about being creative, like making up stuff yourself, making a song, which can involve 8 great notes or 800 great notes. You know what I mean? It just gotta depend. So like you can practice your ass off. I don't know. You can cut that out, but you can practice like crazy, and then you can go out and play, and you're thinking too much, and I hate what I did. You know what I mean? I played it all right, but I wasn't saying anything.
Mm.
You know what I mean? And then you can not play for a long time, and you're so happy to be back at it that you feel like you played great.
Mm.
Even though maybe your chops weren't what they would, because you were more thoughtful. So those are the times, when you can just play and you're enjoying what you're playing, and you're not really thinking about, I'm going to play this on A7th when this comes around, which everybody does, but when you got to get past that stuff, you know what I mean? So that, so jazz is like playing a good solo, even in rock and roll, like playing a great rock and roll, it's a different animal. You want to be creative, you know what I mean? So soloing, you know what I mean? Whether it's rock and roll or jazz or blues, you can be a great player and not enjoy what you did that night. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And I'm sure that's true in the classical world, but it's more of a technical thing.
Right.
Than and I know there's emotion and there's different ways you can interpret stuff. So I'm not saying it's totally that way in classical, but it is more of a technical thing than, that emotional connection that you're feeling right and everything's, you're creating. Mm-hmm. So I've had those nights, and I remember when that started to happen for me.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Well, speaking of technique, what is your kind of favorite go-to technique, either quarterly or, if you're comping or if you're soloing, or one of each?
Well, I don't know. I'm a traditional technique guy, so I don't have a lot of technique that I wish I had. Like even like when you talk about like economy picking, that word didn't exist when I was learning in the late 60s. Okay. At least as far as I know, it didn't. It was called like speed picking or cross picking. And you only learned it ascending, like when you're moving toward the floor, right. Economy picking. But coming back, you did alternate picking. But then I guess maybe in the late 70s or whatever, it developed that the guys coming back would also do economy picking. Huh. And you are faster that way. And I teach that to students, but I don't play that way. I play. So I have good technique. I've always had good chops, but nothing great as far as chops. You know what I mean? I mean, there's students who can play faster than I can. They don't know what I know, but they could certainly play faster than I could play. So, and that's a good thing. I'm never one of those guys because I don't do it that sucks. You're not saying, man, there's guys who say everything you need to say and play fast because that's what's inside of them. I tell students, if that's what's inside of you, if that's what you need to get out, then go for it. You know what I mean? That was never what was inside of me. You know what I mean? But I love guys who have chops and make music out of it. You know, because you could sound crummy playing fast, and you could sound crummy playing slow. You know what I mean? And you could sound great doing both too. You know what I mean? So it's always for me. It's never really about I know how to play with my fingers. I learned because I love bossa nova and I love that. Um, I know how to play with the pick and the fingers together a little bit.
Right.
You know, but for what I need to do, it was for me. It was always about playing a good solo, you know, and having the chops I need to be able to do what I want to say, you know. So it's not about a particular technique that I envy, you know. Like there's a guy in Nashville, this guy Guthrie Trapp, the 30-something guy. Man, if I was gonna play country music, that's who I'd want to play like, because he swings, man. He plays great, and he's got so much of that hybrid picking where he's got two things going on, and he's like awesome at it, man. So I can't do that. So I listen to him for enjoyment.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I can't do what he does, and I'm too old to try. You know what I mean? I'm still learning. Don't get me wrong. I still want to learn, but that's something like it would take me years to get even close to the level that he plays on. So I just listen to him for enjoyment. You know, maybe try to steal some of his licks, but I can't do what he does. And that's one of his go-to techniques. So when you talk about that, so I know what you're asking, but I don't really have that. You know, I have the traditional picking, you know, alternate picking, and like what they call kind of economy picking, but only halfway. You know, and that you know, comping. I love the comp. You know, like play, you know, stabs like you know, but you do that when it's appropriate to do it. You know, so it's not something I'm going to do on a rock and roll gig or, you know, a show or something like that, right? So, you know, that's a good question for a lot of guys. For me, there really isn't a go-to technique that I like to use.
Interesting. This is, I'm going to totally blow the speed thing of this, but how do you kind of learn to jettison stuff like you're just not getting something? When do you kind of say, I got to ditch that? That's not in my wheelhouse. I'm never going to get this thing at all.
You know, I do that early. So I've never really worked on something hard and then got jettison. I got it. You know what I mean? But there's some things, as I know myself so well, I'll start to look at and I'll just say, no, I'm not going to be able to do this. Like that kind of thing, like Tosin Abasi does. Like I got a book on some of that, you know, and I was like, because I was like these modern guys. So I got a couple of books, and one guy plays very modern, but he's a traditional player. So I got some things from him, and there's a lot more I got to get into. But another guy was that hybrid picking, you know, and it's just like, man, I worked on it for a couple of weeks, and I wasn't really getting anywhere, and it wasn't in my heart so much, you know what I mean? So I did jettison it. So that kind of stuff I jettison early. So either I'm going to get it or I'm not. But if I know I'm getting close and it's something I really want to do, I just keep doing it. Sometimes it takes, sometimes it takes a week, sometimes it takes a month, and sometimes it takes longer than that, like several months to really get comfortable with something where it's not in the practice room, you're using it now. You know, it's part of your playing. But most of that for me has been conceptual. You know what I mean? It's not so much technique as it is conceptual. Like I've worked on some technique stuff over the years, you know, recently, but it's just little things, you know, like little things I know I can get if I just keep playing them and practice them every day. I know eventually it's going to get my playing. It's not a question. It's just I can't do it right now, but I know I'm going to be able to do it, you know. So most of my stuff that I work on is more conceptual. Like here's a whole different thing I can do on a dominant seventh chord that I'm not thinking in this way right now. So I have to be able to think in that way, you know. So
what's a song every guitarist needs to hear?
Man, it depends on the style, I guess. But I think every guitarist should listen to, and I'm going to leave some people out, but you should definitely listen to Led Zeppelin and Jimmy, right? If you're playing jazz guitar, you got to definitely listen to Wes Montgomery, all right? And I would say Pat Martino, but believe it or not, most people love Pat Martino, but not everybody does.
Mhm.
Okay. I don't know of any guitar player who plays and knows anything about jazz that doesn't like Wes Montgomery, who doesn't love Wes Montgomery or George Benson.
Interesting.
You know what I mean? So I would say, for guitar, jazz, you got to listen to Wes. And there's a million other guys, but
Right.
you got to listen to Wes, because that's like the source. Um, um, there's other guys. So I said, like, Jimmy Page and just Led Zeppelin in general, Jimi Hendrix, obviously. And, and see, you're going to listen to best. Listen to Eddie Van Halen. Because if that's where you want to go, you got to listen to him. You can't leave him out, obviously, just for inspiration, even if you don't play that way.
Mhm.
And there's several guys like that. I mean, for a modern guy or post bop kind of player, Mike Stern, John Scofield, or guys that you want to listen to, who are steeped in that tradition but went beyond it. You know what I mean? Now there's guys coming up now who aren't steeped in that tradition but still play great. A lot of guys don't like them. I kind of like the modern guys. I find it interesting, It's something I don't approach it that way, but you don't hear the blues in their playing. And a lot of people don't dig that. And I'd rather hear the blues. That's what moves me the most. But there's some of these guys that still, man, they've worked hard and they play great. There's just a different thing coming out of them. You know what I mean? So, but I can't think of, there's a lot of other guys. I mean, you should listen to, if you want to hear great music and you like American music, I mean, you not only guitar players, I mean, you should listen to Oscar Peterson.
Mhm.
You should listen to Dr. Hook, Dr. John, Dr. John. You should listen to Stan Getz. You should listen to Michael Brecker. You should listen, obviously, Charlie Parker. Let's see this. Actually, I have a few more minutes, and I got to split.
Last question.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Advice for anyone who's in a rut?
In a rut.
Yeah, playing rut.
That's a good question too, because we've all been there.
Huh.
It's almost counterintuitive, but if you're a practicer and you're in a rut, take a break from practicing. And don't think about the instrument for a couple of days, all right? And then pick it up and don't practice, just play for enjoyment, I found that helps. Sometimes just reading a book, thinking about something else, something that is, art, looking at paintings and trying to appreciate that, poetry, and then it sounds hokey, but anything that's still going to get your juices flowing, but it's not about music, And don't put that pressure on yourself. And I think that could help sometimes. Now, obviously, you got to keep practicing again, but just try to get a different perspective about it. Some of the times, I remember years ago, in the 80s, I broke my wrist, my right hand, right? And I had a cast. I had to get pins. And so for 6 weeks, I had to take off from Disney. I was like a workman's comp. And I didn't play the guitar. And then, like, the cast was ready to come off, and I had movement. I had much more movement. And I actually took a gig. It was before I went back to Disney. But I took a gig with that cast on, right? Because it was like background music kind of stuff. It was an easy gig. And I can't tell you how emotional, even though I had no chops, I was still able to play some, but I had a cast right here, right up to here. So I had to play a little different.
Wow.
But it was very memorable to me because I appreciated it so much to be able to play, And so I felt like I played really nice that night because I just was so appreciative of being able to play, which I didn't play. Also, after the pandemic, during the pandemic, I played some gigs that were empty. It was an empty room and they live streamed it. And to be honest with you, I kind of hated it because it was so sterile. I got nothing back. And then I just recently had played some gigs with people in the audience, not packed, and they were wearing masks and stuff. but I was so appreciative of that. You know what I mean? Just to have some kind of feedback, some kind of energy coming from the people in the audience, you know. So that was helpful too. But I would my advice would be, if you're in a rut, to don't put pressure on yourself and get away for a couple of days of just not playing music, but try to get some inspiration from other sources.
Cool, cool. Awesome. Thanks so much, man.
Yeah, man.
It's been super great.
It's been great. It's great to see you.
Yeah, that's good.
And yeah, you could, you know, I mean, you don't have to get my approval for anything. You know, you could cut it the way you want to cut it. And, you know, I'd like to take a look at it. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'll send you a link real quick. I'm maybe busy.
Yeah. It's all good, man.
All right.
Thanks so much. And I'll check out the website too. So this is something new you're doing, right?
Yeah, you know, just for, I don't know.
Oh, it's great, man.
We're trying.
You know, another thing we didn't talk about was what I did was I taught for an online teaching site for about 10 years.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And that's a whole nother story I'll tell you about.
Cool. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
All right.
All right, man. All right, Jeff. Thanks, man. I appreciate this.
Got it. Yeah. Awesome.